The most dangerous place for these soldiers wasn't the battlefield, it was the courtroom, a system rigged to ensure black heroes never received the recognition they deserved. In the final of our special compilations for 2025, we are reopening the case files on the 5 worst legal betrayals in military history. The evidence was hidden, the verdicts were rigged, and the innocence of these men was the only thing that didn't matter. He was a soldier in 2 wars at the same time, one against the Germans and one against his own racist officers. He faced prison for obeying the law. If he had lost his sham trial, you would have never heard the name, Jackie Robinson. Camp Hood in 1944 was a sprawling military installation in central Texas, a place where the contradictions of America's war effort collided with brutal clarity. The United States military was fighting a war against fascism in Europe, against an ideology that claimed racial superiority justified genocide. Yet at home, that same military enforced rigid segregation that treated black soldiers as second-class citizens in the very uniform they wore to defend their country. For black officers like Robinson, these contradictions weren't abstract, they were daily humiliations. Robinson had arrived at Camp Hood in April 1944, assigned to the 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black unit that would later earn the nickname the Black Panthers and become one of the most decorated units of World War II. The battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, a white officer who genuinely respected his black soldiers and pushed them toward excellence. Under Bates, Robinson thrived, appointed as the battalion's morale officer due to his influence over the men. But Robinson's path to Camp Hood had been marked by constant battles against discrimination. Born in Cairo, Georgia in 1919, Robinson was the youngest of 5 children in a sharecropping family. After his father abandoned them, his mother, Mally, moved the family to Pasadena, California, working multiple jobs as a domestic worker to support her children. At UCLA, Robinson became the first athlete in the university's history to win varsity letters in 4 sports: baseball, basketball, football, and track. He was already a national celebrity when he was drafted in April 1942. His military service began with a fight. At Fort Riley, Kansas, Robinson applied for officer candidate school. Despite Army policy providing for integrated OCS facilities, Robinson was initially rejected. Off the record, he was told black soldiers were excluded because they supposedly lacked leadership ability. Only after intervention from boxing champion Joe Louis, who was stationed at Fort Riley and had befriended Robinson, did the Army relent. Robinson graduated OCS on January 28, 1943, receiving his commission as a 2nd lieutenant. But his commission couldn't shield him from Jim Crow. At Fort Riley, Robinson challenged the segregated seating at the Post Exchange, successfully persuading officials to enlarge the colored-only section, where black soldiers frequently couldn't find seats. He qualified as an expert marksman with the M1 Garand rifle. Despite never feeling comfortable with weapons or horses, the cavalry was not his element. When assigned to the 761 Tank Battalion at Camp Hood, Robinson found in Colonel Bates a commander who shared his belief that black soldiers deserved equal treatment. By July 1944, Robinson's ankle, injured playing football years earlier, had become a significant concern. In January, an Army medical board had found him fit only for limited duty. On June 21st, he was ordered to McCloskey General Hospital in Temple, Texas, 30 miles from Camp Hood, for final evaluation of his fitness for combat. The injury would ultimately prevent him from deploying overseas with the 761 Est, a unit that would go on to fight for 183 consecutive days in Europe, longer than virtually any other American unit, and participate in major campaigns, including the Battle of the Bulge. On the evening of July 6th, while awaiting test results at the hospital, Robinson obtained a pass to visit Camp Hood. He arrived around 7:30 p.m., hoping to see his battalion. Instead, he discovered they were away on maneuvers. Robinson stopped at the Black Officers Club, where he socialized with friends for a few hours. A teetotaler who never drank, Robinson spent the evening in conversation before boarding a bus around 10 p.m. to return to the hospital. At stop 23, Robinson boarded a shuttle bus operated by the Southwestern Bus Company, driven by a civilian named Milton Renegar. The bus operated within Camp Hood, transporting soldiers and civilians across the sprawling installation to the central bus station, a transfer point where passengers could board other buses for destinations off-post. Boarding the bus, Robinson recognized Virginia Jones, the wife of another black lieutenant in the 761. Jones was light-skinned enough to be frequently mistaken for white. Robinson sat down next to her in the fourth seat from the rear, what Jones herself would later testify she always considered the rear of the bus, and the two began chatting. Several blocks later, driver Milton Renegar glanced in his rearview mirror and saw what he perceived to be a black officer sitting next to a white woman. He had made an assumption that would set in motion a chain of events threatening to destroy Robinson's life. "Hey, you! Sitting beside that woman!" Renegar yelled. "Get to the back of the bus!" Robinson ignored the order. Renegar stopped the bus, marched back to where Robinson and Jones sat, and demanded that Robinson get to the back of the bus where the colored people belong. Robinson refused. What Renegar didn't know, what he apparently didn't care to know, was that Robinson was completely within his rights. Just 1 month earlier, in June 1944, the War Department had explicitly ordered the desegregation of military buses operating on Army posts. The directive was born from practical necessity and mounting pressure from civil rights organizations. Segregation on military transportation had become a flashpoint for racial tension. Black soldiers returning from combat training were being forced to sit in the back of buses while German prisoners of war sat up front. The contradiction had become too glaring to ignore. Robinson was aware of the regulation. He'd read about boxers Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson refusing to move to the backs of buses in the South, and the resulting publicity had prompted the Army's policy change. He also knew he was on federal property, not subject to Texas's Jim Crow laws. The Army recently issued orders that there is to be no more racial segregation on any Army post, Robinson told the driver. This is an Army bus operating on an Army post. Renegar was unmoved. He promised Robinson there would be consequences when they reached the bus station. He kept his promise. At the central bus station, the station dispatcher appeared. Turning to Renegar, he asked if Robinson was the one causing trouble. Shortly thereafter, 2 military police officers arrived. They approached Robinson and asked if he would be willing to come with them to answer questions. Robinson, believing he had nothing to hide, agreed. At the MP station, Robinson's ordeal escalated rapidly. The officer of the day was Captain P-Law Wigginton, the camp's laundry officer pulling duty rotation. When Robinson arrived, one of the escorting MPs, Private First Class George A. Mucklerath, began giving his version of events. Robinson tried to interrupt, insisting Mucklerath's account was inaccurate. Wigginton told him to stop interrupting. Then, according to testimony that would emerge at trial, Mucklerath asked another MP, Corporal George Elwood, if he had a racist language flag lieutenant in the car. Robinson's response was immediate and forceful. He told the enlisted man that, if he ever called me that word again, I would break him in 2. Captain Wigginton, apparently feeling out of his depth, called for Captain Gerald M. Bear, the Assistant Provost Marshal and commander of the Military Police Detachment. Bear, a Southerner, would prove to be Robinson's chief antagonist in the hours ahead. When Bear arrived, Robinson attempted to follow him into the guard room to give his side of the story. Bear stopped him. "Nobody comes in the room until I tell him," Bear said. Yet Private Mucklerath was already in the room and allowed to remain. Bear appeared to want Mucklerath's account, not Robinson's. Robinson was ordered into an adjacent receiving room, separated from the guard room by an open door. Standing near the doorway, Robinson could hear Wigginton briefing Bear on Mucklerath's testimony. Testimony Robinson knew was false. Multiple times, Robinson interrupted to correct inaccuracies in Mucklerath's statement. Bear ordered Robinson to sit in a chair at the far end of the receiving room, away from the door, so he couldn't hear or interrupt. The confrontation escalated. Robinson, frustrated and angry, began questioning Bear about his status. Was he under arrest? If not, why was he being detained? Bear gave ambiguous answers. At one point, Bear told Robinson he could stand at ease, a military posture that allowed some movement and informality, but then criticized Robinson's disrespectful demeanor. Also present during the interrogation was Bear's secretary, a white civilian woman. When Robinson protested the line of questioning, which he believed was racially motivated, the secretary became upset and left the room. This interaction would later be twisted into one of the original charges, insulting a civilian woman. Throughout the interrogation, Robinson maintained his composure but refused to back down. He demanded clarification about whether he was under arrest. He insisted his actions on the bus were lawful. He objected to the racial prejudice he perceived in how he was being treated. To Captain Bear, a white Southern officer accustomed to deference from black soldiers, Robinson's assertiveness read as insubordination. Bear would later characterize Robinson's behavior as disrespectful, impertinent, and sloppy. In his view, Robinson was uppity, a black man who didn't know his place. After the interrogation concluded, Bear arranged transportation for Robinson back to the hospital, but Robinson stated he didn't want to return yet. His pass was valid until 8 a.m. the following morning. Captain Wigginton, viewing this refusal as further disrespect, threatened to arrest Robinson for insubordination. Eventually, Robinson was escorted back to McCloskey Hospital and confined to quarters. But his troubles were just beginning. On July 13th, a document was sent to the Commanding General of the 230 Corps with an investigation report. On July 17th, formal charges were filed against Second Lieutenant Jack R. Robinson. He faced 6 distinct violations of the Articles of War: violation of Article 63, behaving with disrespect toward Captain Gerald M. Bear by contemptuously bowing to him and giving him several sloppy salutes, repeating several times "Okay, sir," or words to that effect, and by acting in an insolent, impertinent, and rude manner. Violation of Article 64, willful disobedience of Captain Bear's lawful command to sit in a chair away from the door, disturbing the peace, conduct unbecoming an officer, insulting a civilian woman, drunkenness. The charges were explosive. If convicted on all counts, Robinson could face dishonorable discharge, imprisonment, and the complete destruction of his military career and reputation. But there was a problem. Robinson's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, read the charges and the investigative report, and believed Captain Bear had conducted an incompetent investigation. Bates knew Robinson's character. He trusted Robinson's account, and he absolutely refused to sign the court-martial papers. Without Bates's signature, the charges couldn't proceed. The solution was as cynical as it was efficient. Transfer Robinson to a different unit. On July 24th, Robinson was reassigned from the 761st Tank Battalion to the 758th Tank Battalion, part of the 5th Armored Group. The 758th's commanding officer had no personal relationship with Robinson and no reason to question the charges. He signed the papers. Years later, Colonel Bates's wife, Taffy, would confirm what everyone suspected. Robinson was transferred from the 761 S8 because Paul refused to sign court-martial papers. Robinson now faced trial. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A guilty verdict would mean disgrace, the end of any military career, and a permanent stain on his record that would follow him for life. In 1944, no one could have predicted Robinson's future in baseball, but they could predict that a dishonorable discharge would close virtually every door available to a black man in Jim Crow America. Robinson needed help. The Army assigned him a defense attorney. Second Lieutenant William Klein, a young lawyer from Texas. But Klein had a problem, and to his credit, he admitted it immediately. "I was raised in the South," Klein told Robinson. "I haven't developed arguments against segregation. I don't think I can be objective." It was an extraordinary moment of honesty from a white Southern lawyer who recognized his own limitations. Rather than defend Robinson half-heartedly, Klein recommended another officer, First Lieutenant Robert H. Johnson, a 32-year-old lawyer from Bay City, Michigan. Johnson had courtroom experience and no Southern background to bias him against a black defendant. Robinson agreed to the change. Johnson became his primary defense counsel, with Klein remaining as co-counsel. The choice would prove crucial. As the trial date approached, Robinson reached out for support. He wrote to Truman K. Gibson, the War Department's civilian aide for matters concerning black soldiers, describing the incident and asking if the newspapers should be notified. Gibson told an aide to follow the case carefully. Senators Sheridan Downey and Hiram Johnson, both from Robinson's home state of California, made inquiries to the Army about the case. The black press began picking up the story. The Pittsburgh Courier and Chicago Defender mentioned the impending court-martial. For the Army, this was becoming a public relations problem. Robinson wasn't just any black lieutenant. He was a celebrity athlete whose name was known nationally. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, were beginning to pay attention. Colonel Edward A. Kimball, commander of the 5th Armored Group, recognized the volatility. On July 17th, he phoned Colonel Walter D. Bye, Chief of Staff of the 5th Corps, begging him to send an independent investigator. "This is a very serious case, and it's full of dynamite," Kimball explained. He added that the bus situation at Camp Hood is not at all good, and feared any officer in charge of troops at this post might be prejudiced. Bye refused to help. By the time the trial date arrived, some movement had occurred in Robinson's favor. 4 of the 6 charges were dropped entirely: disturbing the peace, conduct unbecoming an officer, insulting a civilian woman, and drunkenness. The prosecution couldn't sustain them. Robinson would stand trial on only 2 charges, both stemming from his interactions with Captain Bear, behaving with disrespect toward a superior officer and willfully disobeying a lawful command. Critically, the trial would focus exclusively on Robinson's conduct at the MP station. The judges would hear nothing about the bus incident itself, the very event that had triggered everything. The question before the court was narrow. Had Robinson been insubordinate to Captain Bear? Everything else, the legitimacy of Renegar's order, the racial slurs, the broader context of segregation, was technically irrelevant. On August 2nd, 1944, at 1:45 p.m., the United States vs. Second Lieutenant Jack R. Robinson began. The court-martial tribunal consisted of 9 officers ranging in rank from captain to colonel. Research by military historian Adam Kama would later reveal something that had been unknown for decades. 2 of the 9 judges were black. In a segregated military, this was extraordinary. It meant that at least some of the officers deciding Robinson's fate might understand the racial dynamics at play. 6 votes were required for conviction. The prosecution presented its case first, calling Captain Bear and Captain Wigginton as witnesses. Bear testified that Robinson had behaved disrespectfully and disobeyed orders during the interrogation on July 6th. Wigginton corroborated Bear's account, describing Robinson as very disrespectful. Then Lieutenant Johnson began his cross-examination. Johnson was methodical and devastating. He had Robinson's version of events, and he had studied the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. Now he exploited them. Under Johnson's questioning, Bear admitted he had told Robinson he could stand at ease during the interrogation, undermining the claim that Robinson's casual posture was disrespectful. More critically, Bear conceded that he had never given Robinson a clear, direct order during the interrogation. When pressed repeatedly on exactly what command he had given Robinson, Bear couldn't provide a specific answer. If there was no clear order, there could be no willful disobedience. Johnson also recalled Corporal Elwood as a witness. He asked Elwood directly, "Did Private First Class Mucklerath ever ask you at any time if you had a racist language flag, Lieutenant, in your car?" "Yes, sir, he did," Elwood answered, "at the bus station." With that single exchange, Johnson exposed the racial animus underlying the entire incident. This wasn't about military discipline or respect for authority. This was about white enlisted men and officers who couldn't tolerate a black lieutenant asserting his rights. Robinson testified in his own defense. Johnson wanted the court to see Robinson not as the uppity troublemaker of the prosecution's imagination, but as an educated, articulate officer who had been subjected to racial harassment. Robinson's testimony was measured and precise. He explained his knowledge of the Army's desegregation order for military buses. He described the racial slur and his response to it. When asked if he knew what the offensive word meant, Robinson gave an answer that echoed across the courtroom. "I looked it up once, but my grandmother gave me a good definition. She was a slave, and she said the definition of the word was a low, uncouth person. I don't consider myself to be low and uncouth." The courtroom was silent. Robinson denied willfully disobeying any order. He explained that his only frustration during the interrogation was that Captain Bear wouldn't tell him clearly whether he was under arrest, and if not, why he was being held and questioned. By Bear's own admission, he had given Robinson ambiguous answers. Unlike the prosecution's witnesses, Robinson was subjected to virtually no challenging cross-examination. His account was consistent, credible, and calm. Then Johnson called character witnesses, white superior officers from Robinson's battalion. Captain James R. Lawton and Lieutenant Harold Kingsley testified about Robinson's exemplary service. But the most powerful testimony came from Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates himself. Bates didn't just vouch for Robinson's character, he effusively praised him. Bates described Robinson as an outstanding officer, a leader who commanded respect from his men, and a credit to the 761 Tank Battalion. His endorsement was so strong and went on at such length that the prosecution and the presiding judge had to direct Bates to limit his answers to the questions asked. The message to the court was unmistakable. Robinson's own battalion commander believed so strongly in his innocence that he had refused to sign the court-martial papers, leading to Robinson's transfer. In his closing argument, Johnson framed the case clearly. According to Robinson's later recollection, Johnson told the court, "This was not a case involving any violation of the Articles of War or even of military tradition, but simply a situation in which a few individuals sought to vent their bigotry on a Negro they considered uppity because he had the audacity to exercise rights that belonged to him as an American and a soldier." The court-martial lasted 4 hours and 15 minutes. The 9 officers deliberated by secret written ballot. At approximately 6 p.m., they announced their verdict: not guilty on all specifications and charges. Jackie Robinson was acquitted. The relief must have been overwhelming, but Robinson knew the victory was incomplete. His military career was effectively over. 2 weeks earlier, on July 21st, Army doctors had determined his ankle injury was permanent. The 761st Tank Battalion, his unit, would deploy to Europe without him. They would land at Omaha Beach on October 10th, fight at the Battle of the Bulge, breach the Siegfried Line, and become one of the most decorated units of the war, earning a Presidential Unit Citation and more than 300 Purple Hearts. Jackie Robinson would not be with them. The court-martial had cleared his name, but soured him on military service. A month earlier, he had been willing to waive compensation for his injury and deploy overseas. Now his main desire was to leave the Army entirely. Robinson requested discharge. He was transferred to Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky, where he served as an athletics coach for black soldiers while his request was processed. On November 28, 1944, Jackie Robinson received an honorable discharge from the United States Army. At Camp Breckinridge, Robinson met Ted Alexander, a black soldier tossing a baseball. They struck up a conversation. Alexander told Robinson there was good money to be made playing in the Negro Leagues. Robinson had never seriously considered professional baseball as a career. He had been more focused on football and basketball, but with his military career over and his ankle preventing him from playing football at a high level, baseball seemed like a possibility. In 1945, Robinson signed with the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro Leagues for $400 a month. He traveled across the Midwest, playing excellent baseball, but finding the travel exhausting and the segregation degrading. He later called it a pretty miserable way to make a buck. But someone was watching. Branch Rickey, president and general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, was looking for the right man to break baseball's color barrier. Rickey wasn't just looking for a great player. He needed someone with the character to withstand the abuse, threats, and pressure that would inevitably come. He needed someone who had proven he could stand up to injustice without being destroyed by it. Rickey knew about the court-martial. He had researched Robinson's background exhaustively. The story of how Robinson had stood his ground on that bus, faced down a military justice system designed to break him, and emerged with his integrity intact. That story likely played a significant role in Ricky's decision. On October 23, 1945, Jackie Robinson signed a contract with the Montreal Royals, a Brooklyn Dodgers minor league affiliate, for $600 a month. He played the 1946 season in Montreal, leading the team to the International League Championship. On April 15, 1947, Jackie Robinson walked onto Ebbets Field in Brooklyn wearing number 42. Before a crowd of 26,623 spectators, approximately 14,000 of them black, Robinson took the field as a Brooklyn Dodger, becoming the first African American to play Major League Baseball in the modern era. The path from that courtroom in Texas to that diamond in Brooklyn was direct. If Robinson had been convicted in August 1944, Branch Rickey never would have signed him. The Dodgers couldn't risk their groundbreaking integration experiment on a player with a dishonorable discharge. The court-martial would have derailed everything. But Robinson had won, and 3 years later, he changed America. The significance of Robinson's baseball career is well documented. Rookie of the Year in 1947, Most Valuable Player in 1949, 6 World Series appearances, including 1 championship in 1955, 6 All-Star selections, election to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962. But the significance went far beyond statistics. As historian Henry Louis Gates, Jr. observed, "It is so easy for us to underestimate the enormous significance, both symbolically and politically, of Jackie Robinson's integration of Major League Baseball. His courage and bravery played a major role in the history of integration, both on the field and throughout American society, and no history of the civil rights movement would be complete without noting Robinson's major role." Robinson himself understood the connection between his military service and his later battles. In his autobiography, he wrote of his acquittal at Camp Hood. "It was a small victory, for I had learned that I was in 2 wars, one against the foreign enemy, the other against prejudice at home." The lessons from that 1944 courtroom stayed with Robinson. When he faced racist taunts from opposing players, death threats from fans, and deliberate attempts to injure him with spikes and beanballs, he drew on the same strength that had gotten him through the court-martial. Branch Rickey had famously asked Robinson if he had the guts not to fight back. Robinson did. Not because he was weak, but because he understood strategic resistance. The court-martial had taught him that the system could be made to work, that justice was possible even in an unjust society, but only if you were willing to stand your ground while also playing by the rules designed to keep you down. It was a delicate balance, asserting your rights without giving authorities an excuse to destroy you. Robinson played that balance perfectly. The men involved in Robinson's court-martial had varied fates. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates led the 761 Tank Battalion through some of the fiercest fighting of the European campaign. He was wounded in combat, but survived the war and received numerous decorations. Bates never forgot Robinson, maintaining that his refusal to sign the court-martial papers was one of the proudest moments of his career. Captain Gerald Bear faded into obscurity. His conduct during the Robinson incident was never formally criticized, but the acquittal implicitly repudiated his handling of the case. Lieutenant Robert H. Johnson returned to Michigan after the war and resumed his law practice. For decades, his role in Robinson's defense was largely forgotten. Most accounts credited only William Klein. It wasn't until 1997 that historian Adam Karma's research fully documented Johnson's crucial contribution. Karma's article, Fair Play and Justice, The Court-Martial of Jackie Robinson, won the Keith E. Nelson Distinguished Service Award for exceptional published literary work advancing the understanding of military law. The 761st Tank Battalion became one of the war's most celebrated units. They fought for 183 consecutive days without respite, participated in 4 major campaigns, and inflicted over 130,000 casualties on German forces. They received 11 Silver Stars, 69 Bronze Stars, and approximately 300 Purple Hearts. In 1978, the unit received a Presidential Unit Citation. Their motto, "Come out fighting," became legendary. Jackie Robinson never regretted missing that deployment. Years later, when asked about not serving in combat, he said he had fought his own war, one that was just as important. The broader context of Robinson's court-martial reveals how common such incidents were. The Pittsburgh Courier, a leading black newspaper, cited a mountain of complaints from Negro soldiers about humiliations on buses in the South. In Durham, North Carolina, just weeks before Robinson's arrest, a confrontation on a bus ended with a driver shooting and killing a black soldier who had refused to move to the back. Robinson's case received attention because of his celebrity status and because he had excellent legal representation. Thousands of other black soldiers faced similar discrimination without those advantages. Many were convicted, dishonorably discharged, and had their lives destroyed by a military justice system that enforced Jim Crow. The Army's official policy barring segregation on military buses, issued in June 1944, was supposed to address these problems. But as Robinson's case demonstrated, policies meant nothing if they weren't enforced. Local commanders interpreted directives as they wished. Civilian bus drivers working on military bases ignored regulations with impunity. White officers like Captain Bear saw black assertions of legal rights as insubordination. The contradiction was stark. The United States was fighting a war against Nazi Germany's racial ideology while maintaining its own system of racial oppression. Black soldiers were asked to fight and die for freedoms they themselves didn't possess. As one anonymous black soldier stationed in Mississippi wrote in 1942, "We are treated like wild animals, like we are inhuman. The word Negro is never used here. All they call us are racist language flag. Do this, racist language flag, that. Even the officers here are calling us racist language flag." This was the military Jackie Robinson served in. This was the system he challenged on that bus in Texas. And this was the justice system that tried to break him. The fact that Robinson was acquitted owed something to luck. He had good lawyers, attention from the press, and 2 black officers on his court-martial panel. But it owed more to Robinson's own character. He had stood his ground without crossing the line into behavior that would have justified conviction. He had demanded his rights without giving authorities the excuse they wanted to destroy him. He had been articulate, calm, and credible on the witness stand, and he had told the truth, consistently and powerfully, in a way that made his innocence undeniable. 3 years later, when Branch Rickey asked if Robinson could endure racial abuse without fighting back, Robinson was ready. He had already proven it in a Texas courtroom. Robinson's baseball career lasted only 9 years. He retired in 1956 at age 37, his body worn down by the physical and emotional toll of breaking the color barrier. But in those 9 years, he transformed American sports and helped catalyze the broader civil rights movement. His success proved that integration could work, that black Americans could compete and excel on equal terms with whites if given the chance. Robinson remained active in civil rights work throughout his life. He supported the NAACP, marched with Martin Luther King Jr., and used his fame to advocate for racial justice. He also became a successful businessman and political activist, though his moderate Republican politics sometimes put him at odds with more radical civil rights activists. Robinson died of a heart attack on October 24, 1972, at age 53. By then he had achieved iconic status, but he never forgot where he came from or the battles that made his success possible. In 1997, on the 50th anniversary of Robinson breaking the color barrier, Major League Baseball retired his number 42 across all teams, the only player in any major professional sport to receive such an honor. Every April 15th, Jackie Robinson Day, every player in Major League Baseball wears number 42. But the courtroom in Camp Hood is forgotten. The 9 officers who acquitted Robinson are nameless to history. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's crucial role wasn't documented until more than 50 years later. The bus driver, the MPs, Captain Bear, they're footnotes. What remains is the story of a man who refused to move to the back of a bus because he knew the law was on his side, who stood before a military court and told the truth, who survived a system designed to break him and emerged stronger. Jackie Robinson's legacy isn't just about baseball. It's about the courage to challenge injustice, even when the cost could be everything. It's about understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in courtrooms and on bus seats, and in all the small moments where someone must decide whether to accept indignity or demand their rights. On July 6, 1944, Jackie Robinson made that decision. He refused to move. He accepted the consequences. He fought back within the system, and he won. 3 years later, he walked onto a baseball diamond and changed American history. But the foundation for that moment was built in a military courtroom in Texas, where 9 officers decided that justice mattered more than prejudice. That decision, that small victory in a war against prejudice at home, made everything else possible. Without it, there would be no Brooklyn Dodger in number 42, no integration of baseball, no symbol of possibility for millions of black Americans who saw in Jackie Robinson proof that the barriers could be broken. The court-martial that could have erased Jackie Robinson from history instead forged him into the man who would change it forever. The U.S. Army in Vietnam was collapsing. Soldiers were killing their own officers in over 900 fragging incidents. The military was desperate to make an example of someone. Their choice? An outspoken black soldier who hated the war. There was just one problem. He was innocent. March 15th, 1971. Bien Hoa Air Base, Vietnam. A fragmentation grenade detonated inside the officers' barracks of an artillery unit, tearing through the darkness with lethal efficiency. When the smoke cleared, First Lieutenant Thomas Delwo lay dying, scheduled to leave Vietnam the very next morning. First Lieutenant Richard Harlan would never wake up. Within 90 minutes, the Army had its suspect. Private Billy Dean Smith, a 23-year-old black draftee from Watts, who had the audacity to speak his mind about racism and an unjust war. They would hold him in solitary confinement for nearly 2 years, demand his execution, and build their case on evidence so flimsy it would collapse in spectacular fashion. But what made Billy Dean Smith guilty in the eyes of his commanders wasn't evidence. It was the fact that he refused to be what they called a good soldier. Private Billy Dean Smith never wanted to go to Vietnam. Born in Bakersfield, California in 1948, he was one of 12 children in a family that moved from Texas to the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles when Billy was 9 years old. After graduating from Washington High School in 1967, he worked as a machinist, drove a school bus, and sold cars, picking up whatever jobs he could find. When his draft notice arrived in 1969, he knew exactly what the Vietnam War was and what it represented. He'd watched the Watts riots of 1965, seen the police brutality that sparked them, understood the connection between the violence inflicted on black Americans at home and the violence they were expected to inflict on Vietnamese people abroad. His family convinced him not to resist the draft. They knew what happened to black men who defied the system, especially in 1969, when draft resistance could mean years in federal prison and a destroyed future. So Billy reported for basic training, then advanced individual training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and in October 1970, he shipped out to Vietnam. He arrived with his eyes wide open, knowing the war was wrong, but respecting his family's wishes that he not throw his life away fighting the draft. That respect for his family's judgment would prove costly. Had he resisted induction, he might have faced 2 years in prison. Instead, by trying to survive within the system, he would spend nearly 2 years in solitary confinement for a crime he didn't commit. Vietnam was everything Billy had feared, and worse. The racism that pervaded American society didn't disappear in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It intensified. Black soldiers made up 23% of combat troops, despite being only 11% of the American population. They were disproportionately assigned to the most dangerous positions, disproportionately disciplined for minor infractions, disproportionately denied promotions. A 1972 Defense Department study would reveal that black troops received 34.3% of courts-martial and comprised 58% of prisoners at Long Binh Jail, the largest American military prison in Vietnam. The statistics told the story that every black soldier in Vietnam already knew the system was designed to break them. Billy refused to pretend otherwise. He talked openly about the racism he experienced daily. He questioned why black men were dying to suppress Vietnamese self-determination when black people couldn't exercise basic rights at home. He stated repeatedly that the war was unjust and racially motivated, that he hated the habitual butchery of the Vietnamese people. These weren't quiet grumblings shared only with close friends. Billy made his opposition known because he believed silence was complicity. This honesty made him a marked man. His commanding officer was Captain Randall Rigby, and Rigby's right hand was First Sergeant Billy Willis. Within months of arriving in Vietnam, Billy Dean Smith had received 3 Article 15 non-judicial punishments for what the Army called minor infractions. One punishment was for unsatisfactory shaving, an offense routinely overlooked in combat zones, where soldiers went days without access to proper facilities. The charges weren't about maintaining military standards. They were about putting an uppity black soldier in his place. According to Captain Rigby, Smith was unenthusiastic about closing with the enemy, military jargon for engaging in combat. An article in the Black Scholar would later put it more plainly. 6 months in Vietnam had gained Billy the reputation of having a bad attitude. Billy Dean was not a good soldier. By March 1971, the Army was processing Billy for discharge for unsuitability and unfitness. They wanted him gone, and he wanted to leave. The paperwork was moving forward. In a rational world, this would have been the end of Billy Dean Smith's military career. An early discharge, a young man sent home from a war he never believed in. His family's worst fears about the consequences of resistance avoided. But the early morning hours of March 15th, 1971 would change everything. The explosion that killed Lieutenants Delwo and Harlan was part of a phenomenon that would define the later years of the Vietnam War: fragging. The term came from fragmentation grenades, the weapon of choice for soldiers who decided their greatest threat wasn't the Viet Cong, but their own officers. Between 1969 and 1972, there were over 900 documented or suspected fragging incidents in Vietnam. The reasons varied: officers who ordered suicidal missions, racism, retaliation for excessive discipline, the chaotic breakdown of military order as the war dragged on, and morale collapsed. By 1971, Colonel Robert Heinl declared that our army that now remains in Vietnam is in a state approaching collapse, with individual units avoiding or having refused combat, killing their officers, drug-ridden, and dispirited, where not near mutinous. When Captain Rigby arrived at the scene on March 15th, he immediately claimed that he and First Sergeant Willis had been the intended targets because they were to have slept in the barracks that night. Why they weren't in the barracks that night was never adequately explained, but it didn't matter. What mattered was finding someone to blame, and Captain Rigby knew exactly who that someone would be. As First Sergeant Willis would admit during the eventual trial, his reasoning was brutally simple. Smith was the only man I had problems with, and his was the first name that popped into my head. Think about that for a moment. 2 officers were dead, another wounded, and within minutes the commanding officer decided the guilty party, based not on evidence but on personal animosity toward a soldier who had criticized racism and questioned the war. The investigation that followed wasn't an investigation at all. It was a predetermined conclusion looking for evidence to support it. 90 minutes after the explosion, Captain Rigby called a battalion formation and arrested Billy Dean Smith in front of every potential witness, ensuring that anyone who might testify would know exactly who the Army had decided was guilty. They charged him with 2 counts of premeditated murder for the deaths of Lieutenants Delwo and Harlan, 2 counts of premeditated attempted murder of Captain Rigby and First Sergeant Willis, and assault. The Army was asking for the death penalty. Billy Dean Smith, who had never been convicted of a violent crime, who was being processed for discharge because the Army wanted him gone, was now facing execution for a fragging attack that occurred while his commanders were conveniently absent from the barracks they claimed were their intended sleeping quarters. The Army transported Billy back to the United States and locked him in the Fort Ord stockade in California. His cell measured 5 feet by 9 feet. He spent 23 hours out of every 24 in solitary confinement. No bail, no trial date initially set, just isolation, day after day, month after month, while the Army built its case against him. This treatment wasn't standard procedure for accused soldiers awaiting court-martial. It was punishment before conviction, confinement designed to break a man psychologically before the trial even began. The contrast with how the Army treated white officers accused of war crimes couldn't have been more stark. First Lieutenant William Calley had been convicted in March 1971, the same month as the Bien Hoa fragging, of murdering 22 Vietnamese civilians at My Lai, though the actual death toll exceeded 300. Calley admitted to ordering his men to shoot unarmed villagers into mass graves, to killing civilians personally, to war crimes that shocked even a nation numbed by years of Vietnam War atrocities. His conviction came with a life sentence. President Richard Nixon immediately intervened, ordering Calley released from prison and placed under house arrest in private officer quarters at Fort Benning. Calley lived in comfort, received full officer pay, enjoyed frequent visits from his girlfriend, and would ultimately serve just 3.5 years before being paroled. Billy Dean Smith, not yet convicted of anything, lived in a cell barely larger than a bathroom, isolated from human contact, while the Army prepared to execute him. The difference in treatment was so glaring that anti-war activists and civil rights organizations used it as their primary rallying cry. Billy has spent 18 months in pre-trial solitary confinement on flimsy evidence, while convicted mass murderer Calley lives in luxury under Nixon's protection. The comparison wasn't subtle. Calley was white and had murdered Vietnamese civilians, actions that aligned with the war's objectives, even if they technically violated military law. Smith was black and stood accused of killing white officers, threatening the military hierarchy itself. The system's priorities were crystal clear. 16 months passed, then 18. Billy remained in solitary confinement, while his case became a cause célèbre for the anti-war movement. Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the United States Servicemen's Fund, and the Black Panther Party organized demonstrations and fundraisers. Angela Davis, recently freed from her own politically motivated imprisonment, advocated for Billy's case. Actor Burt Lancaster contributed money for his defense. Civil rights attorney Luke McKissick agreed to represent him pro bono. The Army's attempt to make an example of Billy Dean Smith was backfiring, turning him into a symbol of military injustice and racism. In September 1972, Billy's court-martial finally began at Fort Ord. The proceedings would last 2 months and generate national and international press coverage. This was the first time anyone in the United States had been tried for a fragging committed in Vietnam, and the Army was seeking the death penalty before the presiding judge removed capital punishment from consideration at the trial's start. The jury consisted of 7 career officers, 5 white, 2 black. Not a jury of peers for an enlisted draftee, but what Billy would get nonetheless. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. Captain Rigby and First Sergeant Willis testified that Smith was a disciplinary problem, and they believed he hated them enough to want to kill them. The defense countered with witnesses who testified that resentment against Rigby and Willis was widespread among the troops, that Billy wasn't unique in disliking his commanders. The defense also pointed out an obvious logical flaw. Why would Smith try to kill the very commanding officer who was processing his discharge and sending him home? As defense attorney Louis Monaco explained in a filmed interview, the commanding officer decided that he must have been the target because he was planning to send Billy home. Now, to us, that was absolutely absurd. If Billy thought he was being sent home, he would have swam home. The prosecution claimed to have an eyewitness who had seen Smith running from the scene. When this witness took the stand, he shocked the prosecutor by stating clearly, "The man I saw running was not Billy Dean Smith." Other prosecution witnesses admitted under oath that they had been intimidated by their superiors into making false statements against Smith. The case was collapsing, but the Army pressed forward. Their strongest piece of evidence, or what they claimed was their strongest evidence, was a grenade pin found in Smith's possession that supposedly matched the exploded grenade at the scene. The prosecution called a crime lab technician who testified that he had linked a grenade pin found on Private Smith with a grenade lever found near the scene of the explosion. This forensic evidence was meant to be damning, the physical proof that tied Smith to the weapon. The defense called 3 expert witnesses who systematically destroyed this testimony. One was a firearms and tool marks identification expert for the Institute of Forensic Sciences, and a former police officer. He examined the prosecution's evidence and stated bluntly, "I can take 2 pins pulled apart at random and make a better match than is represented here." The prosecution's forensic link was worthless. Moreover, soldiers in Vietnam commonly carried spare grenade pins as a safety measure in case they needed to disarm live grenades being held with their levers manually depressed. Having a grenade pin proved nothing, except that Smith had been in a combat zone where grenades were standard equipment. Smith himself testified that the pin was planted on him at the time of his arrest. Given that Captain Rigby had decided Smith was guilty within minutes of the explosion and arrested him in front of the entire battalion 90 minutes later, the possibility of evidence planting wasn't speculation. It was the most logical explanation for how a grenade pin ended up in Smith's possession when he had no reason to keep such evidence if he'd actually committed the crime. Then came the moment that destroyed what remained of the prosecution's case. A soldier in Smith's battalion took the stand and testified, "I was in a bunker smoking with Billy Smith when we heard the explosion." An alibi witness, placing Smith somewhere else when the fragging occurred. The prosecution had no physical evidence that could withstand scrutiny, no credible eyewitness testimony, witnesses who recanted under oath, and now an alibi placing their suspect away from the scene. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. On November 14th, 1972, they returned with their verdict. Not guilty of murder, not guilty of attempted murder, not guilty of the assault charges. Billy Dean Smith was acquitted on all 6 serious counts. The only conviction was for resisting arrest, the most minor charge, stemming from Billy spitting at and attempting to knee the officer who arrested him 90 minutes after the explosion. Even this conviction would be overturned 3 years later when the Army Court of Military Review ruled that since Smith was innocent of the underlying charges, the arrest and apprehension was unlawful, and he was entitled to resist such an arrest with reasonable force. 13 members of Smith's family cheered loudly as the verdict was read. After nearly 2 years in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in a cell measuring 5 by 9 feet, Billy Dean Smith walked free on November 14th, 1972. The stockade released him immediately. No apology from the Army, no compensation for the time stolen from him, just freedom. Sudden and overwhelming after months of isolation. The following day, Billy held a press conference. Angela Davis attended. His statement was measured, clear-eyed, and devastating. One of the questions which has been asked of me repeatedly since my acquittal yesterday at Fort Ord concerns how I feel about the system of military justice. Most people want to know whether my acquittal means that I got a fair trial, or insist that it is proof positive that the system works. May I say that the system of military justice is still riddled with injustice. If I had been tried in Vietnam, or if I had failed to receive tremendous popular support throughout the world, or if I did not have a brilliant attorney like Luke McKissack, I would have been railroaded. Considering that I was not tried by a jury of my peers, but by 7 career combat officers, it is clear that the Army had no evidence of my guilt. I was simply singled out as a scapegoat for the 600 fraggings which have occurred in the last 4 years in Vietnam, and which reflect the low state of morale among enlisted men who want to stop the war, stop the defenseless slaughter of Vietnamese. I was chosen for trial because I was an outspoken critic of the war and was not afraid to expose the racism in Vietnam. I am glad to be free, but I can't really be free until the war in Southeast Asia is over. Billy understood what many observers missed. His acquittal didn't vindicate the system. It exposed the system's willingness to destroy an innocent man because he refused to remain silent about injustice. The fact that he was acquitted after 2 years of solitary confinement wasn't evidence that military justice worked. It was evidence that military justice had failed catastrophically, and only overwhelming public pressure and a brilliant defense attorney had prevented a complete miscarriage of justice. The Army's case against Billy Dean Smith had been, as critics called it, a blatant and groundless persecution of an innocent man. The prosecution's own witnesses provided the most convincing evidence of Smith's innocence. One prosecution witness was revealed to have been undesirably discharged from the military 3 different times under 3 different names, his credibility destroyed on the stand. The supposed eyewitness recanted. The forensic evidence was debunked by experts. The supposed motive, hatred of officers who were processing his discharge, made no logical sense. Yet the Army had held Billy in solitary confinement for 20 months, demanded his execution, and only relented when faced with a jury that couldn't ignore the absence of evidence. The identity of the actual person who threw that grenade on March 15, 1971, has never been definitively established. The investigation ended with Billy's acquittal. Whoever killed Lieutenants Delwo and Harlan got away with it, protected by the Army's rush to judgment against a convenient scapegoat. The real investigation had ended 90 minutes after the explosion, when Captain Rigby decided Billy Dean Smith was guilty because he was the only man I had problems with. Everything that followed was an attempt to justify that predetermined conclusion. Billy Dean Smith's case occurred at the intersection of multiple crises tearing at American society and its military. The Vietnam War had destroyed military morale to the point where soldiers were killing their own officers in unprecedented numbers. The civil rights movement had made black service members unwilling to accept the racism that previous generations had endured in silence. The anti-war movement had created networks of support for soldiers who resisted, transforming individual acts of defiance into a collective challenge to military authority. All these currents converged in Billy's court-martial. The fragging epidemic itself revealed the collapse of military discipline and legitimacy. Over 900 documented or suspected incidents between 1969 and 1972 meant that on average, more than 2 fragging attempts occurred every week. Officers in Vietnam began sleeping in different locations each night, never establishing predictable patterns. Some wore flak jackets inside their own camps. Colin Powell, serving as a major in Vietnam during his second tour from 1968 to 1969, recalled, "I moved my cot every night, partly to thwart Viet Cong informants who might be tracking me, but also because I did not rule out attacks on authority from within the battalion itself." The threat came not from enemy forces, but from the soldiers these officers commanded. The Army wanted to make an example of someone for fragging, to send a message that killing officers wouldn't be tolerated. Billy Dean Smith, outspoken, black, opposed to the war, was the perfect scapegoat. His conviction and execution would serve multiple purposes: punish fragging, intimidate anti-war soldiers, and reinforce military hierarchy. The problem was that Billy hadn't done it, and the Army's evidence was so weak that even a jury of career officers couldn't ignore the absence of proof. The treatment Billy received compared to William Calley exposed the military justice system's racial double standard with brutal clarity. Calley murdered Vietnamese civilians by the dozens and lived in comfort while awaiting his appeals. Billy was accused of killing white officers and lived in a cell barely large enough to lie down. The message wasn't subtle. Vietnamese lives didn't matter, but threatening white authority meant the harshest possible punishment. Both cases involved death, military discipline, and the Vietnam War's moral chaos. But only one involved a black man accused of harming the command structure, and that's why only one man spent 2 years in solitary confinement before trial. The statistics on military justice in Vietnam support what Billy experienced individually. Black troops received 34.3% of courts-martial, despite being only 16.3% of draftees. They comprised 58% of prisoners at Long Binh Jail. In 1971, less than honorable discharges were issued to one of every 7 black servicemen, compared to only 1 of every 14 white servicemen. The system was designed to discipline black soldiers more harshly, to view their resistance to racism as insubordination rather than legitimate grievance, to punish them for refusing to be what First Sergeant Willis's generation had called good soldiers. Billy Dean Smith was not a good soldier by the Army's definition. He questioned orders, criticized racism, opposed the war openly, and refused to pretend that black men dying in disproportionate numbers for a failed cause represented anything other than injustice. This honesty, this refusal to perform gratitude for the opportunity to serve, made him dangerous in the Army's eyes, not because he would actually frag officers, but because his example might inspire other black soldiers to speak out, to resist, to recognize that they didn't have to accept the military's racism as inevitable. The anti-war movement's support for Billy demonstrated that resistance to the Vietnam War had evolved beyond individual conscience to organized solidarity. Vietnam veterans against the war didn't just advocate for Billy's release. They held a trial of the Army near Fort Ord that found the military guilty of railroading an innocent man. The United States Servicemen's Fund coordinated demonstrations at Fort Ord and in cities across America and overseas. The Black Panther Party connected Billy's case to broader struggles against institutional racism. Angela Davis, whose own recent acquittal on politically motivated charges had made her an international symbol of resistance, brought her voice and credibility to Billy's defense. This network of support wasn't charity. It was recognition that Billy's case represented something larger than one wrongful prosecution. It was the military's attempt to terrorize soldiers into silence, to use the threat of capital punishment to suppress dissent, to prove that speaking out about racism and opposing an unjust war would be treated as crimes worthy of execution. The movement's success in preventing Billy's railroading demonstrated that organized resistance could challenge even the military's power to destroy individuals who defied it. After his acquittal, Billy faded from public view. He'd spent 2 formative years, from age 23 to 25, in isolation. The psychological toll of 23 hours a day in a cell measuring 5 by 9 feet, facing potential execution for a crime you didn't commit, watching a white officer who murdered hundreds live in comfort while you rotted in solitary confinement, cannot be easily measured or overcome. Billy had survived, had won his freedom, but at what cost? Those years can't be returned. The trauma doesn't disappear because a jury delivers the correct verdict. The military never apologized to Billy Dean Smith. They never investigated who actually threw the grenade that killed Lieutenants Delwo and Harlan. They never compensated him for the 20 months stolen from his life. They never disciplined Captain Rigby or First Sergeant Willis for their rush to judgment, for calling a formation 90 minutes after the explosion, and arresting a man based on nothing more than personal animosity. The Army simply moved on, as if nearly executing an innocent man was just an unfortunate mistake, rather than a deliberate attempt to sacrifice a black soldier to shore up collapsing military authority. Billy's statement after his acquittal remains the most powerful summary of what his case revealed. The system of military justice was riddled with injustice, and only massive public support and brilliant legal defense had prevented his railroading. Without Luke McKissick's skill, without the anti-war movement's pressure, without international attention focused on Fort Ord, Billy Dean Smith would have been convicted on manufactured evidence and circumstantial assumptions. He would have died for a crime he didn't commit, executed to satisfy the military's need for a scapegoat, his name added to the long list of black service members destroyed by the institution they served. The fragging epidemic ended not because the Army executed Billy Dean Smith, but because the Vietnam War ended. American combat troops withdrew, the draft ended, and the military transitioned to an all-volunteer force that couldn't rely on conscription to fill its ranks with unwilling soldiers. The conditions that produced over 900 fragging incidents, the rage and despair of men forced to fight in a war they opposed under officers they despised, dissolved when those men went home and the military had to convince people to enlist rather than drafting them. But the racism Billy Dean Smith experienced, the double standards in military justice, the willingness to destroy black service members who speak out about injustice, these patterns didn't end with Vietnam. They continue in different forms, in disparities in discipline rates and promotion opportunities, in the overrepresentation of black service members in combat roles and underrepresentation in officer ranks, in the presumption that black soldiers who challenge racism are troublemakers rather than patriots, demanding that America live up to its stated ideals. Billy Dean Smith's story matters because it exposes how institutions use scapegoating to avoid confronting their own failures. The Army didn't want to admit that its soldiers were killing officers because morale had collapsed, because the war was lost, because men forced to fight in an unjust cause had turned their weapons on those who sent them into meaningless danger. It was easier to blame one black soldier, to claim that fragging was the work of individual bad actors rather than a symptom of systemic failure. Billy's acquittal forced a reckoning the Army didn't want to have. His case also reveals the power of solidarity and organized resistance. Without the anti-war movement, without civil rights organizations, without public pressure and skilled legal defense, Billy would have been convicted. The military had every advantage. They controlled the evidence, chose the jury, defined the charges, and held Billy in conditions designed to break him psychologically. But they couldn't withstand scrutiny, couldn't maintain the fiction of guilt when activists and attorneys demanded actual evidence, when witnesses recanted under oath, when their forensic case collapsed under expert examination. Individual resistance is brave, but collective resistance can win. Private Billy Dean Smith was never supposed to survive his court-martial. The Army demanded his execution. They held him in solitary confinement for nearly 2 years. They built their case on manufactured evidence and intimidated witnesses. They made him a scapegoat for 900 fragging incidents and the collapse of military discipline in Vietnam. They compared him unfavorably to William Calley, suggesting that a black man accused of killing white officers deserved harsher treatment than a white officer convicted of murdering Vietnamese civilians. The system was designed to destroy him. He survived because he refused to confess to something he didn't do, because his family and community rallied to his defense, because the anti-war and civil rights movements recognized that his case represented more than one man's freedom, because a skilled attorney was willing to fight for an unpopular client, and because even a jury of career officers couldn't ignore the complete absence of credible evidence. In the end, the truth mattered. Not enough to prevent 20 months of solitary confinement, not enough to trigger an apology or compensation, but enough to prevent an execution. On November 15, 1972, the day after his acquittal, Billy Dean Smith told the world that he was glad to be free, but he couldn't really be free until the war in Southeast Asia was over, until the system that had tried to execute him was forced to change. The war ended 3 years later. Whether the system changed remains an open question, answered differently depending on who you ask. But Billy's story endures as a reminder of what happens when institutions prioritize hierarchy over justice. When black men who speak truth to power are treated as threats rather than patriots, and when the military's need for scapegoats outweighs its commitment to finding actual perpetrators. First Lieutenant Thomas Delwo died the day before he was scheduled to leave Vietnam, killed by a fragmentation grenade thrown by someone who was never identified. First Lieutenant Richard Harlan died in his sleep, never knowing what hit him. They deserved justice, a real investigation, an actual attempt to find who killed them. Instead, Their deaths were used to justify the attempted destruction of an innocent man because he was convenient, because he was black, because he'd spoken out, because 90 minutes was apparently enough time to decide guilt without evidence. Billy Dean Smith was the first person tried in the United States for a fragging committed in Vietnam. His acquittal ensured he wouldn't be the last person executed for speaking truth about racism and an unjust war. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt dishonorably discharged an entire battalion of heroic black soldiers without a trial. They were accused of a crime they didn't commit, and their refusal to lie was called a conspiracy of silence. So what actually happened? Mingo Sanders was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1857. As a boy, he'd watched a military parade march through his hometown, the drummer's cadence echoing off the cobblestones, the soldiers moving as one. He decided then he would be a soldier. On May the 16th, 1881, at 24 years old, Sanders enlisted in the United States Army. He was assigned to the 25th Infantry Regiment, one of 4 all-black units created after the Civil War, led by white officers, sent to the most isolated corners of the American West. The Buffalo Soldiers, Native Americans supposedly called them, seeing something familiar in their dark skin and tightly curled hair. These men built forts, strung telegraph lines, fought in the Indian Wars, and did the brutal work white regiments avoided. They deserted less, complained less, and asked for nothing but the respect their service earned. Sanders would spend his entire career with the 25th Infantry. He would give them everything. In 1888, Sanders arrived at Fort Missoula, Montana, with Company B. The town welcomed the black soldiers, a rare thing in 1880s America. They weren't just tolerated, they were respected. Sanders played on the fort's baseball team. He married a woman named Luella Branch. He rose through the ranks to first sergeant, the highest position available to an enlisted man. When a young white lieutenant named James Moss proposed an experimental mission in 1896, Sanders was among the first to volunteer. Lieutenant Moss wanted to prove that bicycles could move troops faster than horses. The 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps was born. 20 black soldiers, 3 white officers, riding modified Spalding bicycles with steel rims and reinforced frames. Each bike carried 80 pounds of gear, tents, bedrolls, rations, rifle, ammunition. The riders would test the bicycles first on a trip through Yellowstone, then on something far more ambitious. On June 14, 1897, Sanders and 19 other soldiers departed Fort Missoula for St. Louis, Missouri, 1,900 miles across mountains, plains, and prairies. 41 days. Sanders, at 39, was the oldest rider and acting first sergeant of the Corps. He would be the backbone. They crossed the Continental Divide through summer snow. They waded through the Little Big Horn River, carrying their bicycles on their shoulders. They camped at the spot where Custer fell 21 years earlier. In Montana, newspapers barely mentioned their race. In Wyoming, the weather nearly killed them. Exhaustion and low visibility left them lost in a storm. In Nebraska, extreme heat and poisoned water made them sick, the alkali turning their stomachs inside out. But Sanders kept them moving, kept their spirits high, kept the mission alive. Missouri was different. The further east they traveled, the colder the reception. A farmer asked if they were Union soldiers. When told yes, he said, "Then you can pile right off this land." Someone from his house shouted they could camp below the pigsty. This was the America Sanders had been fighting for. On July 24, 1897, they rode into St. Louis. Nearly 1,000 cyclists met them at the city limits, escorting them through cheering crowds to Forest Park. They'd covered 1,900 miles in 41 days, averaging 56 miles per day at 6 miles per hour. "The most marvelous cycling trip in the history of the wheel," declared the St. Louis Star, "and the most rapid military march on record." Sanders and his men had proven their point. The army stopped caring almost immediately. But there was no time to rest. War with Spain erupted in spring 1898, and the 25th Infantry was among the first units mobilized. Sanders found himself on a transport ship to Cuba, headed for the campaign that would make Theodore Roosevelt a national hero. The Spanish dug in at El Caney, a fortified position threatening American forces. On July 1, 1898, the 25th Infantry assaulted the position under withering fire. Sanders was hit. Shrapnel from an explosion tore into his face, partially blinding him. But the 25th took El Caney, relieving pressure on Roosevelt's Rough Riders and the 10th Cavalry's Buffalo Soldiers, who together captured San Juan Hill. During the campaign, Sanders encountered Colonel Roosevelt. The Rough Riders were short on supplies. Sanders shared his unit's rations, hardtack and bacon, with Roosevelt's men. Roosevelt wouldn't forget that sergeant from South Carolina, but he wouldn't remember him the way Sanders hoped. After Cuba, Sanders served in the Philippines, continuing to earn commendations from his commanding officers. By 1906, he'd given 25 years to the Army. He was 2 years from retirement, 2 years from the pension that would secure his future. His record was spotless. Brigadier General Andrew S. Burt called him a sergeant with character excellent and said he was the best non-commissioned officer I have ever known. That July, the 25th Infantry's 1st Battalion was ordered to Fort Brown, just outside Brownsville, Texas. The town of 6,000 sat on the Mexican border in Cameron County. It was segregated by law, divided by custom, and poisoned by hate. When word came that black soldiers were coming, Anglo and Mexican residents alike reacted with horror. They didn't want the 25th Infantry in their town. They would find a way to remove them. Companies B and C arrived on July 28, 1906. Sanders commanded Company B. From day one, the soldiers faced abuse. They couldn't drink at the 3 bars run by white residents. Customs inspectors physically assaulted them. Store owners refused their business. The hostility was palpable, dangerous, building toward something terrible. On August 12th, a rumor spread. A black soldier had attacked a white woman. The allegation was never proven, but it didn't matter. The town was ready to explode. Major Charles Penrose, the battalion's white commander, consulted with Mayor Frederick Combe. They agreed on an early curfew for August 13th to prevent trouble. All soldiers were ordered to remain in their barracks after taps. Shortly after midnight on August 14th, gunfire erupted in Brownsville. Shots tore through the darkness for 10 to 15 minutes. When it ended, Frank Natus, a white bartender, was dead. Police Lieutenant M.Y. Dominguez lay wounded in the street. The town instantly blamed the black soldiers. Major Penrose was awakened by the sound of gunfire. He immediately ordered a roll call. Every soldier was present. He inspected every rifle. None had been fired. He counted every cartridge. None were missing. His officers confirmed it. The soldiers had been in their barracks. The evidence was clear. Whoever shot up Brownsville, it wasn't the men of the 25th Infantry. The town didn't care about evidence. A citizens' committee formed that morning, headed by retired Army Captain William Kelly. Before their investigation even began, they'd already reached their conclusion. Their interviews started with the same question. State what you know about this attack of the Negroes on this town. They produced spent Army rifle cartridges found in the streets, claiming they proved the soldiers' guilt. No one questioned how those cartridges got there. No one asked why spent shells were conveniently scattered around town, but none were found inside the fort. No one wondered why the timing was too perfect, the evidence too convenient. Major Augustus Bloxham arrived to investigate. He found no proof that any soldier participated in the shooting. The physical evidence contradicted the town's story. Guard duty rosters made it nearly impossible for anyone to have left the post unnoticed. But Bloxham recommended that if the soldiers refused to identify the guilty parties, they should all be discharged, every single one of them. The soldiers were interrogated, pressured, threatened. Name the men who did this, they were told, or you'll all pay the price. To a man, they insisted on their innocence. They had no names to give because they'd done nothing wrong. But their honor, their refusal to lie, would be twisted into evidence of guilt. Texas Ranger Captain William McDonald arrived, the man famous for coining the phrase, "one riot, one ranger." He investigated 12 enlisted men, building a case for conspiracy. A Cameron County grand jury reviewed his evidence. They returned 0 indictments. Even a Texas court in 1906 couldn't find grounds to charge these men. But in Washington, Inspector General Ernest Garlington had already made up his mind. The soldiers' refusal to name the guilty parties proved a conspiracy of silence, he declared. Without a shred of evidence that any soldier fired a shot, Garlington recommended they all be discharged without honor. President Theodore Roosevelt agreed. Roosevelt didn't act immediately. He waited until after the congressional elections in November 1906. The Republican Party needed black voters in the North, and Roosevelt knew this decision would enrage them. So he delayed, waited until the votes were counted, until the political cost was minimized. Then, on November 9th, 1906, he signed Special Order Number 266. 167 soldiers of the 25th Infantry Regiment were discharged without honor. No court-martial, no trial, no chance to defend themselves, no confronting their accusers, no cross-examination of witnesses. The Constitution guaranteed due process of law. Roosevelt denied it to every one of them. First Sergeant Mingo Sanders was the highest-ranking soldier discharged. At 49 years old, with 25 years of service, he lost everything: his career, his pension, his honor, his future. Men with 20 years of service, men within months of retirement, men who'd fought for this country in 3 wars, all destroyed by one order from the man Sanders had shared his rations with in Cuba. The black community erupted. They'd supported Roosevelt, trusted him, celebrated when he invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House. Now they felt betrayed. Washington himself pleaded with Roosevelt to reconsider. Roosevelt refused. Mary Church Terrell, the prominent civil rights activist, took up Sanders' cause. With her help, Sanders was allowed to re-enlist on December 12, 1906, but without his rank, without his pension, without acknowledgement that any wrong had been done. One man refused to let this injustice stand: Senator Joseph Foraker of Ohio. A Republican like Roosevelt, a former Union Army captain who'd fought to end slavery, Foraker saw the Brownsville affair for what it was: a constitutional atrocity. He was also Roosevelt's political enemy, positioning himself to challenge for the presidency in 1908. But whatever his motives, Foraker became the soldiers' champion. He was meticulous, relentless. The former lawyer dissected every piece of evidence, exposed every contradiction, revealed every unproven assumption. In January 1907, Foraker forced the Senate to authorize an investigation by the Committee on Military Affairs. Sanders became the face of the wronged soldiers. Harper's Weekly put him on their cover in January 1907, head bowed, holding discharge papers, his medals visible, captioned simply, "Dishonorably discharged." On February 11, 1907, Sanders appeared before the Senate committee. His testimony was quiet, devastating. "I'm a poor man. I've served my country honest and faithful. I offered my life to be destroyed for the government, my body to be buried in the earth, and cattle to eat grass off the substance of my blood. And now I am to be cast on the world as a condemned man. Can't you do something for me?" At the Gridiron Dinner on January 27, 1907, Foraker and Roosevelt clashed publicly. The program showed cartoons and verses mocking the attendees. Foraker's read, "All coons look alike to me," suggesting his Brownsville stance was merely to attract black voters. Roosevelt was furious, glaring at his opponent. Then Foraker rose to speak. He tore into Roosevelt's decision, defending Sanders by name, declaring the sergeant as innocent of any offense against the law of any kind whatever as the president himself. Never before had a president been challenged so directly in such a setting. Never before had anyone called Roosevelt out like this to his face. The clash destroyed Foraker politically. Roosevelt turned the party machinery against him. When Foraker ran for re-election in 1908, Roosevelt personally intervened, calling Foraker's re-election nothing less than treason to the party. Foraker lost his Senate seat. His political career was finished. But he never stopped fighting for the Brownsville soldiers. The The Senate hearings dragged on for months. In March 1908, the majority report sided with Roosevelt. A minority of 4 Republicans found the evidence inconclusive. Foraker and one other senator filed their own minority report, asserting the soldiers' complete innocence and exposing the contradictory, insufficient, and contrived evidence. In March 1909, Roosevelt signed a bill allowing a board of inquiry to review cases for possible re-enlistment. Of the 167 discharged men, only 76 could be located. 6 didn't wish to appear. The board interviewed about half of them. In the end, they offered re-enlistment to 14 men. 11 accepted. The other 153 remained destroyed. Sanders settled in Washington, D.C. President Taft, who'd succeeded Roosevelt and held his own grudge against the former president, appointed Sanders to federal positions, a pointed reminder of Roosevelt's mistake. But Sanders never recovered what he'd lost. His pension was gone. His rank was gone. His dignity had been publicly shredded. On August 15, 1929, Mingo Sanders died at Freedman's Hospital on the Howard University campus. He was 72 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery beside the other soldiers he'd served with for nearly 3 decades. His wife Luella would join him there in 1942. They were both laid to rest with military honors, despite the dishonorable discharge that had shadowed Sanders' final years. For 66 years, the case remained closed. The soldiers were guilty because Roosevelt said they were guilty. The military investigation was sufficient because the military said it was sufficient. Justice had been served because the government said it had been served. Then in 1970, historian John D. Weaver published The Brownsville Raid. He'd spent years investigating, tracking down records, interviewing survivors' families. His conclusion was unambiguous. The soldiers were innocent. They'd been denied due process. The evidence against them was planted. They'd been sacrificed to appease a racist Texas town and protect a president's political standing. Weaver's book reached Congressman Augustus Hawkins of Los Angeles. In 1972, Hawkins introduced legislation calling for another Defense Department review. The Army reopened the investigation. Their conclusion matched Weaver's. The soldiers of the 25th Infantry were innocent. The discharge was unjust. On September 28, 1972, 66 years after Roosevelt's order, President Richard Nixon signed a bill granting honorable discharges to all 167 soldiers. For most, it came decades too late. Nearly all were dead. Their lives had been destroyed, their reputations ruined, their families left without the pensions and benefits they'd earned. Only one man lived to see vindication. Dorsey Willis was the youngest soldier discharged in 1906, only 18 years old then, 87 now. In 1973, Congress passed a special act granting Willis a tax-free pension of $25,000. Willis accepted it with grace, but his words carried the weight of 67 wasted years. I'm very grateful. It's a great birthday present, but it comes too many years too late. The Brownsville affair stands as one of the most shameful episodes in American military history. 167 innocent men were destroyed without trial because a Texas town demanded a scapegoat and a president chose political expediency over justice. First Sergeant Mingo Sanders, the man who'd proven black soldiers' worth on a bicycle across America, who'd saved white soldiers' lives in Cuba, who'd given everything to a country that gave him nothing in return, became the face of that injustice. His testimony before the Senate in 1907 echoes across the decades. I offered my life to be destroyed for the government, my body to be buried in the earth, and cattle to eat grass off the substance of my blood, and now I am to be cast on the world as a condemned man. America took his life. America took his honor. 66 years later, America gave him back a piece of paper saying, "Honorable discharge." It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was the closest thing to justice Mingo Sanders would ever receive. August 15th, 1944. Dawn breaks over Puget Sound as 2 military policemen discover a body hanging from an obstacle course cable at Fort Lawton, Seattle. The dead man wears an undershirt marked Italy. Within hours, 43 black soldiers will be charged with his lynching. The prosecutor assigned to the case is an ambitious 39-year-old lawyer named Leon Jaworski, who sees this trial as his ticket to prosecuting war criminals in Europe. What happens next would be buried in classified files for 60 years. When the truth finally emerged, it would reveal how one of America's most celebrated legal heroes built the foundation of his legendary career on a deliberate miscarriage of justice. Fort Lawton sat on the bluffs overlooking Seattle's Magnolia neighborhood in August 1944, a major embarkation point for troops shipping out to the Pacific Theater. Approximately 10,000 soldiers passed through the base that summer, including 3 segregated port companies of black servicemen trained to unload ships in combat zones. The 651st and 652nd Port Companies were scheduled to deploy to the Pacific on August 15th. Their brothers in the 649th Port Company threw them a going-away party on the night of August 14th. Also stationed at Fort Lawton were approximately 200 Italian prisoners of war, members of what the Army called the Italian Service Unit. These weren't die-hard fascists. They were carefully selected prisoners who had been interviewed by military intelligence and deemed apolitical. With Mussolini dead and Italy switching sides in the war, the State Department was courting Italy's new government. The Italian prisoners received pay, uniforms, and privileges that seemed generous to many observers, including passes to downtown Seattle, where they could visit taverns and attend dances with local women. The black soldiers noticed. They were fighting for a country that still denied them basic dignity, housed in segregated barracks adjacent to enemy prisoners who enjoyed freedoms they didn't. The Italian Service Unit barracks sat next to what Fort Lawton's white officers called the colored area. Black soldiers couldn't enter the same taverns the Italian prisoners visited. They watched enemy combatants go on dates with American women while they faced Jim Crow restrictions, even in a northern city. The resentment simmered through that hot August. Just after 11 p.m. on August 14th, 3 Italian prisoners returning from a night in Seattle walked past a group of black soldiers socializing in front of their barracks. Corporal Willie Montgomery, a 39-year-old from New York City who had been drinking heavily at the going-away party, said something. According to Giuseppe Bell, one of the Italians, Montgomery came at him cursing Bell, a small man himself, threw a left hook that knocked Montgomery unconscious with a single punch. The Italians ran for their barracks. Montgomery's friends gathered around him as he lay on the ground. 2 military policemen patrolling in a jeep arrived within minutes. The MP in charge was Private Clyde Lomax, a white soldier responsible for patrolling the colored area. Although Montgomery had regained consciousness, Lomax insisted on driving him to the hospital. There were 2 hospitals at Fort Lawton, but Lomax drove to the one on the far side of the base, taking Montgomery away from the brewing confrontation. What happened next remains disputed, but the results were clear. Groups of black soldiers, many believing their comrades had been attacked by enemy prisoners, moved toward the Italian barracks. Some grabbed fence posts and rocks. The Italians, hearing projectiles against their windows in the darkness, panicked. Some jumped from windows. A melee erupted. The military police response was inexplicably slow. Frantic phone calls came from the Italian quarters, but 30 to 45 minutes passed before a contingent of MPs arrived. By then, 26 Italians had been injured, some seriously. One would spend 16 months recovering. 3 black soldiers and 3 white soldiers who had been in the Italian orderly room were also hurt. The MPs restored order without taking anyone into custody. Every MP later claimed it had been too dark to identify any participants. You can't tell them apart, they explained. At 5 a.m. the next morning, Private Clyde Lomax drove his jeep to a distant gully at the base of Fort Lawton's Magnolia Bluffs. Accompanied by a black MP, he claimed to discover the body of 31-year-old Guglielmo Olivotto hanging from a rope attached to an obstacle course cable. Olivotto was barefoot, wearing only boxer shorts, an undershirt, and a khaki shirt with an Italy patch. He had been strangled to death. The discovery of a lynched Italian prisoner created an international crisis. This wasn't just a military matter, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. Italy had switched sides. The State Department was actively courting the new Italian government. The murder of an Italian prisoner by American soldiers could jeopardize that relationship. The War Department needed swift justice and clear convictions to demonstrate that America would not tolerate such misconduct. By sunset on August 15th, Fort Lawton's commanding officer, Colonel Harry Branson, had ordered all evidence destroyed. No fingerprints were secured, no footprints preserved, no weapons properly catalogued. The damage to the Italian barracks was repaired and repainted within 24 hours, eliminating all physical evidence of what had occurred. When Branson attempted to ship the black soldiers to San Francisco that same day, a subordinate reported his actions to the Pentagon. The order was countermanded, but the damage to the investigation had already been done. The riot and lynching made front-page news across America. The Army needed someone who could deliver convictions in this politically sensitive case. They chose Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski, a rising star in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Leon Jaworski was born in 1905 in Waco, Texas, the son of Polish and Austrian immigrants. A brilliant student who studied by oil lamp, he became a champion debater, graduated from Baylor Law School, and passed the Texas bar at age 19. He was so young that he needed a judge to declare him legally an adult before he could practice law. By 1944, he had built a reputation as an aggressive, ambitious prosecutor who understood that high-profile cases could launch legendary careers. The Fort Lawton case offered exactly what Jaworski wanted. If he could secure convictions, he would prove himself capable of handling the war crimes trials that would follow Germany's defeat. The White House and State Department were watching. The pressure for convictions was immense. Jaworski saw his opportunity. Before Jaworski even arrived in Seattle, Brigadier General Elliot Cook had been sent to investigate the riot and lynching. Cook's job wasn't to prosecute the attackers, that would be Jaworski's role, but to determine who among Fort Lawton's officers had failed to prevent the incident. Cook conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing dozens of witnesses and examining every aspect of what had happened. What Cook discovered was damning, but not for the black soldiers. His report concluded that Colonel Branson had botched the criminal investigation by ordering evidence destroyed. The report recommended Branson's demotion or reassignment. More significantly, Cook's investigation revealed that Private Clyde Lomax and Staff Sergeant Charles Robinson, the first MPs to respond, had shown what Cook described as, if not cowardice, a decided lack of proper training, and also a flagrant disregard of the Articles of War. The Cook report documented that Lomax had been present at virtually every key moment. He had been at the post exchange when tensions first flared between white soldiers and Italians on August 12th and 13th. He had been the first MP to respond when Montgomery was knocked unconscious. He had inexplicably driven Montgomery to the distant hospital rather than calling for backup. He had disappeared for critical minutes during the riot, and he had conveniently discovered Olivotto's body. Most damningly, Cook's report noted that during the riot, Lomax had failed to call for help, failed to notify his chain of command, and had essentially abandoned his post at the precise time Olivotto disappeared. According to witness statements collected by Cook, at least one white soldier had been seen among the attackers, hitting Italians with a baton. Cook's investigation recommended that Lomax be court-martialed. Cook's report was classified, officially to protect war secrets. The real secret was the incompetent conduct of Fort Lawton's white officers and the suspicious behavior of Private Lomax. A copy of this report was given to Leon Jaworski. It was not given to the black soldiers or their attorneys. Jaworski spent weeks conducting interrogations. He offered immunity to soldiers who would agree to testify against their comrades. Most refused, including Private Samuel Snow and Private Roy Montgomery. But 5 black soldiers agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for immunity. Decades later, investigators would discover that all 5 had personal grudges against the men they accused. The identification witnesses Jaworski planned to use were even more problematic. Most of the 200 Italian prisoners couldn't identify a single black soldier, citing darkness and confusion. But 2 Italians offered confident identifications of dozens of Americans. Jaworski made these 2 men his key witnesses. A review conducted years later would reveal that both had been previously identified as unreliable security risks by the Military Intelligence Corps. Jaworski knew this when he put them on the stand. On November 6, 1944, Jaworski charged 43 soldiers with rioting, a crime carrying a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Every single defendant was black. 3 men, Luther Larkin, Arthur Herx, and William Jones, also faced charges of premeditated murder. They could be hanged. This was the largest court-martial of World War II. The 43 defendants were provided exactly 2 lawyers to represent them all, Captain Howard Noyd and Captain William Beeks. They were given 10 days to prepare their cases, 10 days to interview 43 clients, investigate a complex incident, and prepare a defense against the Army's most ambitious prosecutor. The trial began in late November 1944 and would last 5 grinding weeks. The 9-member court-martial panel was composed entirely of white officers. The law member who would rule on all motions and objections was Lieutenant Colonel Gerald O'Connor, a civilian lawyer in peacetime. William Beeks was an experienced defense attorney who immediately recognized problems with the prosecution's case. The government had no physical evidence, no weapons linked to any defendant, no fingerprints, nothing. The case rested entirely on witness testimony, and Beeks suspected that testimony was deeply flawed. As the trial proceeded, Beeks grew increasingly concerned that Jaworski was hiding something. During cross-examination of Private Roy Damond, one of the black soldiers, Jaworski referred to an earlier interrogation of another defendant. Beeks had no record of that interrogation. When he asked Jaworski to provide it, the prosecutor claimed the document was in the possession of an Army investigator O'Connor. The law member didn't press the issue. On December 8, 1944, Beeks discovered for the first time that Jaworski had been given access to General Cook's lengthy confidential report. This was the report that documented Colonel Branson's destruction of evidence, Private Lomax's suspicious behavior, and the recommendation that Lomax be court-martialed. This was the report that might have completely discredited Jaworski's key witnesses. Beeks demanded access to the Cook report. Jaworski refused, citing concerns about wartime security. This was a lie. There were no war secrets in the report, only evidence of command failure and potential white culpability. Beeks appealed to O'Connor, arguing that the defense had a right to see any evidence that might exculpate their clients. O'Connor sided with Jaworski. The report would remain sealed. Without access to the Cook report, Beeks couldn't pursue his most promising defense strategy. He suspected that white soldiers, possibly Lomax himself, had killed Olivotto and used the riot as cover. The Cook report would have supported this theory, but Beeks never learned what it contained. He never learned that Cook had criticized Lomax extensively. He never learned that Cook had recommended Lomax's court-martial. He never learned that Lomax had been present at every key moment, including earlier confrontations between white soldiers and Italians. Jaworski called Lomax to testify against the black soldiers, the same man whose behavior General Cook had found suspicious, the same man Cook recommended be court-martialed, took the stand as a prosecution witness. When Jaworski showed him a rope and asked if this was the type used to hang Olivotto, Lomax confirmed it. The actual murder weapon had disappeared, but newspapers never mentioned that astonishing fact. The trial became a spectacle. FBI agents attended, watching for communists or sympathizers who might exploit the proceedings. One black columnist for the Northwest Herald was singled out in FBI intelligence reports for observing that when the enemy can get better treatment than the citizens of the country who captures him, something is bound to happen. In his closing argument, Jaworski painted a picture of organized brutality and savagery. He called for the death penalty for the 3 men charged with murder, claiming they had directed and inspired the assault. The spectacle, the emotion, the pressure for convictions in this internationally significant case all of it worked in Jaworski's favor. Beeks, outraged that men were being convicted based on single witnesses with no corroboration, made his final appeal to the court's sense of justice. The panel acquitted 15 defendants, but they found 28 guilty of rioting. 2 of those, Luther Larkin and William Jones, were also convicted of manslaughter in Olivotto's death sentences ranged from 6 months to 25 years at hard labor. All but 1 defendant received dishonorable discharges. Leon Jaworski had his convictions. The War Department had its political victory. Jaworski got exactly what he wanted, a prominent role in prosecuting war criminals in Germany. He would go on to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy for the Warren Commission. In 1973, he would become the special prosecutor in the Watergate scandal, arguing before the Supreme Court that not even the president was above the law. His principled stand against Richard Nixon would make him a national hero. The Fort Lawton defendants got what they always get in these stories. Luther Larkin died in 1948, his dreams of becoming a medic destroyed by his conviction. The others scattered across America, carrying dishonorable discharges that denied them veterans' benefits, barred them from government employment, and marked them as criminals for the rest of their lives. Samuel Snow returned to Leesburg, Florida. He had joined the Army hoping to become a mechanic and use his GI Bill benefits. Instead, he worked as a church janitor. The dishonorable discharge followed him everywhere. "You think about it all day, all the time," Snow later said. "It never leaves you. I couldn't get no military job. I couldn't get civil service for years." Private Clyde Lomax, whose behavior General Cook had found so suspicious, was quietly court-martialed in January 1945, not for murder, not for lynching, but for failure to report for duty. Based on his inaction during the riot, he received a dishonorable discharge and disappeared from the historical record. The transcripts of his court-martial, because it was a special rather than general proceeding, were sealed or destroyed. Lomax died in 2004, having never been publicly questioned about what really happened to Guglielmo Olivotto. For decades, the Fort Lawton case existed only as a footnote in military history, the largest court-martial of World War II, forgotten by everyone except the men who had been convicted and the families who watched them suffer. In 1986, a Seattle television reporter named Jack Heyman was walking through Discovery Park, the former site of Fort Lawton. Someone mentioned an unusual grave marker in the old military cemetery. Heyman found it, a tall column inscribed in Italian, Guglielmo Olivotto, October 23, 1911 to August 14, 1944. Heyman began asking questions. What he learned led to a documentary that won an Emmy Award. But that documentary, based on secondary sources and official accounts, essentially repeated the Army's version of events. Black soldiers had rioted and lynched an Italian prisoner. The story might have ended there, but something bothered Heyman. Black men committing a lynching using a noose? An internationally infamous trial completely absent from history books? It didn't add up. In 2001, Heyman and his wife, Leslie, decided to investigate the story properly, using primary sources. It took 4 years, but the Heymans eventually found what Leon Jaworski had hidden. In the miscellaneous section of the National Archives World War II collection, recently declassified, sat Brigadier General Elliot Cook's report. As Heyman read it, he realized the full scope of what Jaworski had done. The Army had known, before the trial even began, that its detectives had thoroughly botched the investigation. The Army had known that the defendants were fingered by highly suspect informants. The Army had known that Private Lomax's behavior was suspicious and that he should be court-martialed. Leon Jaworski had known all of this, and he had fought successfully to keep it from the defense attorneys. Hammond's 2005 book, On American Soil, How Justice Became a Casualty of World War II, laid out the full story. The book caught the attention of Representative Jim McDermott, a Seattle Democrat, who read it and couldn't put it down. McDermott introduced legislation demanding that the Army reopen the Fort Lawton case. Republicans were expected to oppose it, but Representative Duncan Hunter, a conservative Republican, reviewed the evidence and agreed. Together, they exercised a congressional privilege that forced the Army Board for Correction of Military Records to review the convictions. On October 26, 2007, the board ruled unanimously that Leon Jaworski had committed egregious error in his prosecution of the Fort Lawton case, particularly by refusing to make the Cook report available to the defense. The board called the trial fundamentally unfair and overturned all 28 convictions. The defendants were issued retroactive honorable discharges and deemed entitled to all rights, privileges, and property lost as a result of the convictions. By then, 63 years had passed. Of the 28 men wrongfully convicted, only 2 were still alive. Samuel Snow, now 83 and living in Leesburg, Florida, learned of his exoneration from a friend. "I got the news," Snow said. "I was glad and I was uplifted, and the burden came off of me." On November 29, 2007, Samuel Snow received a check from the United States Army for $725. It represented his back pay from December 1944 to March 1946, the 15 months he had spent in military prison. No interest, no adjustment for inflation. $725 for 63 years of carrying the weight of a wrongful conviction. Snow refused to cash the check. He called Jack Hammond and asked what he should do. The check came with language suggesting that cashing it might waive his rights to future claims. Snow wasn't interested in a bureaucratic pittance. He wanted what the Army Board had promised: full restoration of all rights and privileges. Representative McDermott pushed back. The Army's payment was insulting, he argued. Congress eventually passed legislation, signed by President George W. Bush, requiring the Army to pay proper compensation with interest. In October 2008, Snow's family would receive a check for $27,580, but Samuel Snow wouldn't be there to see it. In July 2008, the Army scheduled a formal ceremony at Discovery Park in Seattle. Samuel Snow, now 84 and in failing health, traveled from Florida to receive his honorable discharge in person. On July 25th, he attended a celebratory dinner with Jack Hammond and the families of other wrongfully convicted soldiers. That night, Snow began experiencing problems with his pacemaker. He was taken to Virginia Mason Medical Center. On July 26, 2008, the ceremony proceeded without him. Assistant Secretary of the Army Ronald James offered a formal apology to the Fort Lawton 28. An Army band and color guard provided military honors. Representatives McDermott, Seattle Mayor Greg Nichols, and King County Executive Ron Sims paid tribute. Samuel Snow's son Ray attended the ceremony, then returned to his father's hospital room with the honorable discharge certificate. Snow, too weak to speak, held the certificate against his chest and smiled. 13 hours later, he died of congestive heart failure. He was 84 years old. He had waited 64 years to hear his country admit it had wronged him. He held that piece of paper for 13 hours before his heart gave out. The Fort Lawton case reveals something essential about American military justice in the Jim Crow era. The injustice wasn't random. It wasn't the result of confusion or honest mistakes. It was deliberate, methodical, and executed by one of the most celebrated legal minds of the 20th century. Leon Jaworski knew the Cook report existed. He knew it documented evidence destruction, command failure, and white culpability. He knew his key witnesses had been flagged as unreliable. He knew the defense had a right to this information. He withheld it anyway, then stood before the court and called for black men to hang. The same man who would become a national hero for standing up to Richard Nixon built his career on the backs of innocent black soldiers. The same legal mind that would argue before the Supreme Court that no one is above the law deliberately violated the most basic principles of legal ethics to secure convictions he knew were unjust, and he got away with it for 63 years. Long enough to die a hero. Long enough that when the truth finally emerged, he wasn't alive to answer for what he'd done. Private Guglielmo Olivotto was killed on August 14, 1944. The evidence suggests strongly that Private Clyde Lomax, a white military policeman with a history of harassment toward both black soldiers and Italian prisoners, had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the murder. Lomax had lied about his whereabouts. He had failed to call for backup during the riot. He had disappeared during the critical minutes when Olivotto vanished. He conveniently discovered the body in a remote location. General Cook had recommended his court-martial, but Lomax was white, and convicting a white soldier of lynching an Italian prisoner wouldn't serve the political purposes of the War Department or the career ambitions of Leon Jaworski. So 43 black soldiers were charged, 28 were convicted, and justice became a casualty of war. The Fort Lawton defendants weren't anomalies. They were part of a systematic pattern of military injustice that targeted black servicemen throughout World War II. While black soldiers comprised approximately 10% of the army, they represented 79% of soldiers executed for crimes in the European theater. Of 70 soldiers executed in Europe during the war, 55 were black. The military justice system didn't serve justice. It served the prejudices and priorities of white commanders who saw black soldiers as expendable. The 43 men charged at Fort Lawton had volunteered to serve their country. They had endured segregation, discrimination, and the daily humiliations of Jim Crow, both in the civilian world and in uniform. They watched enemy prisoners receive better treatment than they did, and when violence erupted, not because of their actions, but because of systemic tensions the army had created by housing black soldiers next to prisoners who had more privileges, the black soldiers were the ones who paid the price. Samuel Snow's son, Ray Snow, speaking at his father's memorial, said something that captures the essence of this story. "The love of my father's life was there for him," Ray said, referring to his mother, Margaret, who had stood by Samuel for 61 years. So it's comforting. It is good. It closes a chapter. But does it? Can a chapter be closed when justice comes 64 years late? When the man who perpetrated the injustice died celebrated and honored? When the compensation amounts to less than $1,000 for 15 months in prison and a lifetime of dishonor? The Fort Lawton case reminds us that the first draft of history is always written by those in power. For 60 years, the official history said that black soldiers had rioted and lynched an Italian prisoner. It took a journalist's curiosity, years of investigation, and an act of Congress to force the truth into daylight. How many other cases remain buried? How many Samuel Snows died without vindication? How many Leon Jaworskis built legendary careers on deliberate miscarriages of justice that will never be uncovered? The Fort Lawton 28 were exonerated, but they weren't made whole. 26 of them died before they could hear their country apologize. Of the 2 who lived to see vindication, 1 died within hours of receiving it. The Army's apology came too late to give them back their careers, their dignity, or the decades they spent marked as criminals. And Leon Jaworski? He died in 1982, his reputation intact, celebrated as a hero of American justice. His grandson defended him, suggesting that the Fort Lawton case was simply not one of his finest moments, as if deliberately withholding exculpatory evidence to secure wrongful convictions was merely a lapse in judgment rather than a fundamental betrayal of everything the law supposedly stands for. The 43 black soldiers charged at Fort Lawton weren't asking for special treatment. They were asking for the same justice that would be afforded to any American accused of a crime. They asked to see the evidence against them. They asked for adequate time to prepare a defense. They asked that prosecutors follow the ethical rules that govern legal proceedings. They didn't get it, because in Jim Crow America, black soldiers weren't entitled to justice. They were convenient scapegoats for command failures, useful tools for ambitious prosecutors, and expendable bodies that could be sacrificed to serve political purposes. The Fort Lawton case isn't ancient history. Samuel Snow died in 2008. Some of his family members are alive today, still carrying the weight of what was done to their father and grandfather. Guglielmo Olivotto's family in Italy never learned the truth about who really killed their son and brother. Private Clyde Lomax took his secrets to the grave, and somewhere in America, in federal archives and classified files, there are surely more Fort Lawtons waiting to be discovered, More cases where ambitious prosecutors built careers on the backs of innocent black soldiers. More instances where the first draft of history was a lie, and the truth remains buried under decades of institutional silence. The Fort Lawton 28 were finally vindicated. But vindication isn't justice. Justice would have been Leon Jaworski facing consequences for deliberately withholding exculpatory evidence. Justice would have been Clyde Lomax answering for what he did to Guglielmo Olivotto. Justice would have been Samuel Snow receiving his honorable discharge in 1946 instead of 2008, living his life free from the burden of a wrongful conviction. What the Fort Lawton 28 received wasn't justice. It was acknowledgement, 6 decades too late, that justice had been denied. There's a difference. A black soldier was sentenced to hang for a crime he didn't commit. The evidence was flawed, and the confession was coerced. Then 33,000 citizens rushed to sign a petition in time to save him. Was it enough? Leroy Henry arrived in England as part of the massive American build-up before D-Day. Like more than 130,000 other black soldiers stationed in Britain, he served in a segregated unit, the United States Army in 1944, operated under strict racial separation. Black soldiers wore the same uniform, faced the same enemy, but lived in different barracks, ate in different mess halls, and were overwhelmingly assigned to support roles rather than combat positions. Henry drove trucks for the services of supply, part of the unglamorous but essential work that kept armies moving. The dangerous, dirty jobs that white soldiers avoided became the domain of black units. It was exhausting work, and when soldiers got leave, they sought whatever relief they could find in the English countryside. The British people had welcomed black American soldiers with a warmth that shocked many of them. Unlike the rigid segregation they knew back home, British pubs served them alongside white soldiers. British families invited them to dinner. British women danced with them at community halls. A 1943 survey by Mass Observation, a British social research organization, found that 75% of British civilians disapproved of American racial segregation. The Daily Mail newspaper noted that the feeling is fairly common that the soldiers of color are nicer and better behaved than the ordinary Yank. This British attitude infuriated white American officers who expected their hosts to enforce American-style segregation. The culture clash would reach its breaking point in a ditch beside a road in Combe Down, just outside Bath. Around midnight on May 5th, Irene Maud Lilly heard tapping at her bedroom window. Opening the door, she found Corporal Leroy Henry standing in the moonlit street. He claimed to be lost, asking for directions back to his base. Lilly agreed to walk with him to show him the way to the railway station. Her husband waited. When she didn't return, he went searching and found his wife lying in a ditch by the roadside. She told him Henry had attacked her. British police picked up Henry walking along the same road shortly afterward. They turned him over to American military authorities. Within hours, he was in custody. Within days, he would face a court-martial that would reveal the full machinery of racial injustice in the United States Army. The trial began on May 25th, 1944, just 20 days after the alleged incident. This speed itself was extraordinary. Complex capital cases typically required months of preparation. Henry's defense attorneys received 10 days to prepare. The court-martial board consisted of 9 white officers and 1 black officer. No one questioned whether 10 days was sufficient time to prepare a defense in a case where a man's life hung in the balance. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on Lilly's testimony. She claimed Henry had knocked on her window, asked for help, then dragged her into a field and attacked her at knife point. But the physical evidence told a different story. Or rather, there was no physical evidence. No knife was ever found, despite intensive searches of the area by both British and American military police. They searched every inch of the field twice. Nothing. The examining doctor found no injuries consistent with a struggle. No defensive wounds on Lilly. No scratches, no bruises, no torn clothing beyond what might occur in any outdoor encounter. Lilly claimed she screamed. Yet neighbors in the surrounding houses, interviewed by investigators, heard nothing unusual that night. The silence was deafening. Henry's character witnesses painted a picture completely at odds with the prosecution's portrayal. His commanding officers testified he was reliable, well-liked, never caused trouble. No one in his unit had ever seen him carry a knife. No one had ever witnessed violent behavior. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of soldier any army would want. But the prosecution had something more powerful than evidence. They had a confession. Henry had signed a statement admitting to the attack, and in 1944, in a military courtroom, a signed confession from a black defendant accused of assaulting a white woman was all any prosecutor needed. How had investigators obtained this confession? 2 military police officers testified about the interrogation. Henry, they said, had been questioned intensively. The details they provided painted a picture of coercion that should have alarmed anyone concerned with justice. Henry had been denied food for 24 hours before the interrogation. He had been forced to stand at attention for 45 minutes during questioning. The MPs admitted they had made these demands. They saw nothing wrong with their methods. Even the officer who witnessed Henry sign the confession expressed doubts. He later stated he was amazed that such a man could be guilty of such a crime, and believed Henry had confessed only because he thought it was the right thing to do. The officer's bewilderment should have raised red flags. Instead, it was noted and ignored. The defense pointed out the contradictions. Lily's story changed in the telling. Her husband's account didn't match hers. The timeline made no sense. Why would a lost soldier attack a woman helping him find his way, then continue walking calmly down the same road where he would inevitably be found? Why would Lily, in her nightdress, walk 100 yards in the dark to help a stranger find a road that was clearly visible in the bright moonlight? Why had no one heard screams in a quiet residential area? None of it mattered. On May 26, 1944, the court-martial board convicted Leroy Henry of aggravated rape. The sentence was death by hanging. He would be transferred to Shepton Mallet Prison, the United States Army's principal military prison in the European Theater of Operations. There, American soldiers convicted of capital crimes faced execution, usually by hanging, occasionally by firing squad. 18 American servicemen would be executed there during World War II, 16 by hanging. All but 2 were black. The military justice system had worked exactly as designed. A black soldier accused of assaulting a white woman had been processed, convicted, and sentenced to death in 3 weeks. Under Army regulations, Henry's case would be reviewed by a board of review, but these reviews typically upheld convictions. Appeals were rare, reversals even rarer. For a black soldier convicted of a crime against a white woman, mercy was almost unheard of. Henry was moved to the condemned cell at Shepton Mallet. The prison had recently installed a new execution chamber, its gallows ready. Albert Pierre Point, Britain's most experienced hangman, had trained American executioners in the proper technique. Everything was prepared for Leroy Henry to become another statistic in the grim mathematics of military executions, where black soldiers made up less than 10% of American forces, but accounted for 79% of capital convictions in the European theater. But something unexpected happened. The British people refused to accept the verdict. The Bath Chronicle published news of Henry's conviction and death sentence on May 29, 1944. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Within hours, a petition campaign began in Bath, spearheaded by Jack Allen, who owned a transport cafe in Holloway, and his friend Alderman Sam Day. They demanded clemency for Leroy Henry. The very next day, the Daily Mirror, Britain's biggest-selling tabloid read by millions, published the story. Their editorial the following day was unequivocal. The conviction was wrong. The sentence was barbaric. The man should be freed. The Tribune and the New Statesman joined the campaign. Letters poured into newspapers from across Britain. British citizens began writing to their members of Parliament. The Ministry of Information, which monitored public opinion, reported widespread concern. People were angry, not just about one case, but about what it represented. They had seen how the American army treated its black soldiers. They had watched white American MPs try to enforce segregation in British pubs. They had witnessed white American officers attempt to ban their black comrades from social events. The British people had tolerated this uneasily, understanding the need for Allied unity. But a death sentence based on such flimsy evidence was too much. Bath residents who knew Lily's reputation began speaking out. Neighbors described her as a well-known bad lot. Multiple witnesses testified she had engaged in relationships with other soldiers. None of this would matter in a just legal system. A woman's sexual history has no bearing on whether she was assaulted. But in 1944, such testimony carried weight, particularly when it contradicted the prosecution's portrayal of a respectable housewife victimized by a predatory black soldier. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in New York learned of the case and entered an official plea for Henry's release. The League of Colored Peoples in Britain mobilized. Their General Secretary wrote to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, claiming to have received many letters from British people demanding commutation of the sentence. He urged the general, in the interest of humanity, to review the case. And the petition grew. Jack Allen and Sam Day worked tirelessly, carrying petition sheets to every corner of Bath and beyond. Workers signed at factory gates, shopkeepers signed in their stores, teachers signed at schools. When they presented the petition to Eisenhower on June 8th, it ran to hundreds of pages containing 33,000 signatures. Alderman Day described the signatories as men and women of every station in life. It was one of the largest grassroots campaigns in wartime Britain. Eisenhower was in an impossible position. D-Day had launched just 2 days earlier, on June 6th. The fate of the invasion hung in the balance. German forces were fighting desperately to throw Allied armies back into the sea. Eisenhower was coordinating the largest military operation in history, and yet this case demanded his attention because it threatened to poison relations with Britain, whose support was essential to the entire war effort. American military officials were furious about the British intervention. They viewed it as unwarranted interference in American military justice. Colonel Jock Lawrence, public relations officer for the European Theatre of Operations, was particularly incensed. He determined that the British press must be prevented from depicting the United States as some uncivilized nation. The Americans demanded press censorship in rape cases. The British refused. But the pressure was undeniable. On June 2nd, Eisenhower ordered a second review of the court-martial. This review was assigned to Captain Frederick J. Berthollet, the Assistant Judge Advocate for the European Theatre of Operations. Berthollet was thorough and unsparing in his assessment. His report systematically dismantled the conviction. Henry's confession had been forced, Berthollet concluded. The defendant was an ignorant soldier who had not understood what he was signing. The interrogation methods employed were coercive and improper. Lily's conduct cast doubt on her credibility. Her story contained too many inconsistencies. The physical evidence contradicted the accusation of violent assault. The timeline made no sense. Most damningly, Berthollet found that the evidence presented was insufficient to support the conviction. There was no basis for a retrial because there was no credible evidence that a crime had occurred. His superior, Judge Advocate General Edward C. Betts, reviewed Berthollet's findings and concurred completely. The report reached Eisenhower's desk on June 17, 1944. He signed it the same day. Leroy Henry was acquitted of all charges and restored to duty. Within days, he was sent to France to rejoin his unit. He would serve out the war without further incident. The speed of Henry's exoneration, once proper review occurred, revealed how flawed the original trial had been. 3 weeks to convict and sentence a man to death. Less than 3 days to overturn that conviction, once someone actually examined the evidence carefully. The contrast exposed the fundamental injustice of a system that presumed guilt when the accused was black and the accuser was white. Statistics tell the larger story, of which Henry's case was just one example. During World War II, 152 American soldiers were charged with rape in France. Of those, 139 were black soldiers. The United States Army executed 29 soldiers for rape. 25 of them were black. No white soldiers were executed for rape in England during the entire war. Only black soldiers faced the hangman for that crime. The pattern extended beyond rape. Black soldiers were far more likely to receive death sentences for any crime. In the European theater, 25 black soldiers were executed for murder compared to 4 white soldiers. 22 black soldiers were executed for rape compared to 6 white soldiers. 8 of the 12 soldiers executed for rape and murder were black. These numbers reflected a justice system where race determined outcome more reliably than evidence. The disparity wasn't limited to death sentences. Black soldiers were court-martialed at far higher rates than white soldiers. They received harsher sentences for identical crimes. They were less likely to have sentences reduced on appeal. At every stage of military justice, from arrest through execution, the system treated black soldiers more harshly than white soldiers. American military officials knew about these disparities. They had the statistics. Reviews by the Judge Advocate General's office documented the pattern, but no one was willing to acknowledge that segregation itself created this injustice. No one wanted to admit that the same racism that separated soldiers by color also infected every court-martial board, every review process, every clemency decision. After the Henry case, American authorities changed their approach to managing the British response to military justice. They couldn't stop the British press from covering trials. The British government had refused to impose censorship, so the Americans found another solution. From November 1944 onward, the crime statistics they shared with British officials ceased to distinguish between white and black soldiers. The evidence of racial disparity simply disappeared from official reports. This erasure was deliberate. If the British couldn't see the pattern, they couldn't protest it. If no one could prove that black soldiers were executed at vastly higher rates, no one could demand reform. The American military chose to hide the injustice rather than end it. The system that nearly killed Leroy Henry continued operating throughout the war and beyond. Dozens more black soldiers were executed on evidence no stronger than that used against Henry. Many left letters maintaining their innocence. Their families were told they had shamed their race by committing heinous crimes. The truth was that they had been processed through a machinery of racial injustice that presumed their guilt and denied them fair trials. Consider the evidence that convicted Henry. An inconsistent accusation. No physical evidence. No weapon. No injuries. No witnesses to any struggle. A confession obtained through food deprivation and physical coercion. That was sufficient to sentence a black soldier to death in 3 weeks. White soldiers accused of similar crimes with similar evidence either weren't charged, weren't convicted, or had their sentences reduced on review. The Leroy Henry case became famous because the British public intervened. But for every Leroy Henry saved by international pressure, there were dozens of black soldiers who had no such salvation. They died alone, their names unknown beyond military records that documented their executions in clinical detail. The Army's approach to these executions was methodical and efficient. Professor J. Robert Lilly of Northern Kentucky University, who has studied military executions extensively, describes them as well-organized mechanical rituals. As the military became more familiar with executions, they became increasingly truncated events. What had initially been solemn occasions became routine administrative procedures. The condemned man was led to the gallows. The hood was placed over his head. The trap was sprung. The entire process took minutes. The body was buried in an unmarked grave at Brookwood Cemetery or another military burial ground. The file was closed. The British people who saved Leroy Henry likely never knew how many other black soldiers they couldn't save. They knew only that the conviction they had witnessed was unjust. They understood that a man was about to be killed on evidence that wouldn't have convinced them in a civilian court. They refused to be complicit in that injustice through their silence. 33,000 signatures represented an extraordinary act of moral courage. These weren't civil rights activists or political radicals. They were ordinary British citizens, men and women of every station in life, who saw an injustice and refused to accept it. They signed their names, knowing they were directly challenging the American military during wartime. They risked straining the Allied relationship, at a moment when unity was essential for victory. They signed anyway because some things matter more than diplomatic convenience. The life of one innocent man mattered more than smooth relations between governments. Justice mattered more than avoiding awkward conversations about American racism. Truth mattered more than the convenient fiction that military courts were impartial. The petition succeeded because it made Henry's case impossible to ignore. Eisenhower could not quietly allow the execution to proceed with 33,000 British citizens demanding answers. The Daily Mirror could not be silenced. British members of Parliament could not be dismissed. The pressure created space for Captain Berthollet to conduct an honest review, and his review exposed the conviction for what it was: a legal lynching wrapped in the procedures of military justice. But the very fact that such pressure was necessary reveals the system's fundamental corruption. Without British intervention, Henry would have died. The Board of Review had already upheld his conviction. The standard appeals process had failed him. Every safeguard that supposedly prevented wrongful executions had failed. Only international embarrassment forced the system to correct itself, and even then, the correction was limited to one case. The American military didn't investigate how many other black soldiers had been convicted on similarly flawed evidence. They didn't review other cases where confessions had been coerced or physical evidence was absent. They simply freed Henry, claimed the system had worked as designed, and continued executing black soldiers at the same disproportionate rates. After the war, some American veterans of the military justice system began speaking more honestly about what they had witnessed. They described how they had been ordered to ensure black defendants received harsh sentences to maintain discipline. They recounted how evidence was ignored when it contradicted racial assumptions. They admitted that they had participated in a system they knew was fundamentally unjust, because orders were orders, and questioning the system meant risking their own careers. These admissions came too late for the men who had already been executed. They came too late for the families who spent decades believing their sons and husbands had committed terrible crimes. They came too late for the black communities that internalized the message that their young men were inherently criminal and violent. The Leroy Henry case could have been a turning point. The evidence of systemic racial injustice was undeniable. The British press had documented it. The statistics were clear. The flawed procedures were exposed. The American military could have used this moment to reform its justice system, to ensure that race stopped determining outcomes, to create real protections for defendants regardless of color. Instead, they chose to hide the evidence, suppress the statistics, and continue executing black soldiers at rates that had no explanation except racism. The machinery of injustice kept operating because those with the power to stop it chose not to. After the Henry case, American military officials demanded and eventually achieved near total control over information about military justice. They stopped sharing racial breakdowns of convictions and executions. They restricted press access to trials. They created procedures that made it almost impossible for civilians to learn about military justice cases until long after the executions had occurred. The publicity that saved Leroy Henry was prevented from saving others. The American Battle Monuments Commission eventually buried most of the executed soldiers in proper cemeteries with headstones. But for decades, those headstones didn't acknowledge how these men died. Their families often weren't told the full circumstances. The executed soldiers were treated as shameful secrets, their stories suppressed to avoid embarrassing questions about American military justice. It would be more than 50 years before scholars began systematically examining these cases. Professor Lilly's research uncovered the full extent of the racial disparity. Other historians documented specific cases where innocence was obvious, but executions proceeded anyway. Gradually, the truth emerged. The United States military had operated a two-tiered justice system where black soldiers faced execution for crimes that white soldiers committed with impunity. Some executed soldiers have been exonerated posthumously. In other cases, including Fort Lawton and the Houston riot, the Army has acknowledged wrongful convictions and cleared the names of dozens of black soldiers. These belated acknowledgments of injustice offer no comfort to the men who died or the families who mourned them, but they serve as a historical record that the injustice was real, systematic, and preventable. Leroy Henry returned to duty in June 1944 and served out the war. The historical record doesn't tell us what happened to him after VE Day. We don't know if he went home to St. Louis. We don't know if he married, had children, built a life in peacetime. We don't know if he ever spoke about his 3 weeks in the condemned cell at Shepton Mallet, waiting to hang for a crime he didn't commit. We know only that he survived because 33,000 strangers in a foreign country cared whether he lived or died. We know that British citizens in the middle of total war, with their own sons dying in France, took time to demand justice for one black American soldier. We know that ordinary people, with no power except their moral conviction and their willingness to sign their names, forced the most powerful military in the world to admit it was wrong. The lesson of Leroy Henry isn't just about one wrongful conviction overturned. It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to be complicit in injustice. Those 33,000 signatures represented 33,000 people who saw an injustice and said no. They had no obligation to care about an American soldier. They gained nothing from intervening. They risked complicating relations between allies at a critical moment in the war. They did it anyway because they understood that injustice anywhere diminishes us all. They understood that allowing an innocent man to die through their silence would make them accomplices to murder. They understood that the only way to stop systematic injustice is for ordinary people to refuse to tolerate it. Today, Bath has a small memorial to the extraordinary events of May and June 1944. It acknowledges the petition campaign and the lives it saved. Not just Leroy Henry's life, but the moral lives of those thousands who refused to look away from injustice. The American military's justice system would eventually be reformed. Racial segregation ended. Protections for defendants improved. The disparities in capital sentences, while not eliminated, decreased. These changes didn't happen because military leaders suddenly developed conscience. They happened because people like those 33,000 petitioners refused to accept injustice as inevitable. But change came too late for dozens of black soldiers executed on evidence that wouldn't have convinced a fair court. It came too late for men who died maintaining their innocence, while a system that presumed their guilt processed them toward execution. It came too late for families who were told their loved ones were criminals when they were victims of a corrupted justice system. The story of Leroy Henry is a story of injustice interrupted, not ended, just interrupted. For one man, on one day, the machinery of racial injustice failed to complete its work because people intervened, but the machinery kept running. More black soldiers were arrested, tried, convicted, and executed using the same flawed procedures that nearly killed Henry. Every wrongful conviction that goes uncorrected creates another. Every execution based on coerced confessions and racial assumptions makes the next one easier. Every time a system fails to correct itself, it becomes more entrenched. The only thing that stops systematic injustice is systematic resistance. The 33,000 British citizens who signed that petition weren't heroes. They were ordinary people who did what conscience demanded when confronted with clear injustice. They set an example that echoes across decades. When you see injustice, you speak. When you see an innocent person being killed by a corrupted system, you act. When you have no power except your moral conviction and your willingness to sign your name, you do it anyway. Because sometimes 33,000 signatures are enough to save a life. And that life, that one life preserved against the machinery of injustice, proves that resistance matters. It proves that ordinary people have power when they choose to use it. It proves that no system of injustice is so powerful that it cannot be challenged. Leroy Henry walked out of Shepton Mallet prison because people cared, not because the system corrected itself, not because justice was inevitable, because 33,000 people signed their names and said no. That's the lesson. That's the power we all have. That's what changes the world.